This is Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Aaron by Torsten Weitzer, narrated by Gilbert Jackson. 764 years earlier. The figures slowly peeled away from the soaring column of smoke, which was becoming denser. They were different shapes and races, but they all exhibited the same facial expressions, which fluctuated between exhaustion, satisfaction, and confusion. They clambered up the last few paces of the newly formed crater and turned around. They looked up for a while in silence at the pall of smoke, a good 1,000 paces in diameter, which rose, smooth and dense, like a black wall in front of them. It hid the being within from the eyes of creation. One of the figures asked in a tired voice, without looking away, "Will it suffice?" "It must suffice," answered another. "We cannot do more, so long as one of us is missing." There was a short pause before the voice continued. "If everything goes according to plan, it will only be for a short time." One by one, the bedraggled forms turned away, leaving the pillar of smoke in their wake. It pointed towards the heavens, like a warning black finger, defying the wind and the time. Chapter 1. It was the sudden croaking of an ogre frog that woke Aaron up from his slumber. Startled, he looked down at the creature, a good forearm in length, which had woken him so rudely. With a frown and a wave of his hand, he shooed the troublemaker away, and with an almighty leap the frog found the safety of the river, some distance from the drowsy youngster. "Stupid frog," Aaron muttered to himself as he reached for his fishing rod. It was only now he noticed the waning intensity of colour in his surroundings, which could only have been caused by the encroaching dusk. "The three be with me!" blurted the youngster, now fully awake, as he suddenly realized he'd slept the afternoon away. A closer look at the rod revealed that a fine, big creature must have taken the bait, because the line had been snapped. With a sigh, he imagined the splendid specimen and wondered how he had slept through the tugging of the fishing line. A look around him answered his question. Here, in the bend of the river, he was protected from the wind, far away from all the other villagers and their activities. The river was 4 paces in width, and the willows, hanging low over it, afforded shade from the sun without covering him to the point that it would be cool. The sluggish stream lapped gently around stones that stuck out of the water and lulled anyone who was a good listener to sleep. The soft grassy bank had done the rest, and so the idyllic surroundings had carried him away to the land of Nod. Aaron stood up slowly, but now he was in for a rude awakening. As he stood there and looked around, he noticed that his bait-box, with its rare and coveted God's Day flies, was lying knocked over on the ground. These flies were used to catch the equally coveted and delicious blue shoal fish, which always fetched a handsome price at the market. Master Kossuth always took one off him whenever Aaron managed to catch some, and paid him with a large chunk of the delicious cheese he made so well. Aaron bent down to look for the flies, and was startled to see tooth and claw marks on the wooden box. Martens had feasted on his bait. Unfortunately, these pests had just as much a weakness for the God's Day flies as the blue shoal fish. They were called God's Day flies because they only hatched on the days of the gods and died the same night. But if you caught them on the day and locked them away so they couldn't see moonlight, then they would survive until the next God's Day. unless, of course, they served as bait for blue shoal fish. Aaron realized with exasperation that his full supply of flies was gone, which would have provided him with another 3 days' fishing. Snorting with anger, he flung the useless box into the river and put his rod on his shoulder. As he reached for his bucket with the day's catch, a despondency, such as he hadn't felt in a long time, came over him. His catch had been stolen too. He thought of what his father would say once he arrived home with no fish and no flies, not to mention a snapped fishing line, and felt a lump in his stomach. His backside was already sore at the mere thought of it. With slumped shoulders, he made his way homewards, a journey that suddenly felt terribly long. He beat his way through thick bush and came out onto a small path which led from his home village of Deepstone and ran through the eastern forest. This was a small, dense forest which snaked alongside the river like a green ribbon. While it took hardly any effort to reach the west side of the wood from the river-bank in less than an hour, it took 2 or 3 days' march to get through it by sticking to the river. That's what Falk, the forest guardian, said, anyway. A feeling of imminent disaster, caused by his father's scorn, hung over him, and it seemed to the 13-year-old that the wood was stretching itself out. An hour became a small eternity as he walked between the trees towards the sound hiding that was waiting for him. The sun set slowly in high summer and accompanied him on his return journey. It still wasn't dark when he stepped out from the trees and paused on the edge of the village. Deepstone clung to the edge of the forest and mirrored the eastern forest in its form. It was more than 10 times longer than it was wide. Each house was no more than a bowshot from the wood, for it hadn't taken long for the inhabitants to realize that the trees offered protection from the cold wind that swept over the hills of Eastland. A few had tried to build their wooden houses further away with little success. In the best-case scenario, this meant that twice the amount of wood was needed for heating in winter, and in the worst case, a family member would succumb to the Blue Death. Old Vera, the village healer, said the winter wind would then no longer want to leave the afflicted person's lungs. And indeed the howling of the winter wind could be heard again with every wheezing breath that passed between the blue lips of the victim. Aaron's mother had died in this way, shortly after his birth, too weak her body could offer no resistance to nor defy the Blue Death. Not one of the wailing houses, as they were called by the other inhabitants, was in use for more than one winter. Each and every family abandoned the house the following spring and built a new one in the shelter of the wood instead. And so the little village resembled a small version of the protecting wood. The houses stood in a row, like a wooden pearl necklace, along the edge of the forest, in groups of no more than 4 or 5 houses together. The village population of Deepstone would never have amounted to its current 200 inhabitants, were it not for the fact that the land here was fertile and yielded a good harvest every year. Everything seemed still. It was high time for supper, and, of course, it would have been blue shoal fish on the table at home today, if Mother Nature hadn't kindly lulled Aaron to sleep with her peace and quiet, only to make him then pay such a high price. The boy trod with a sigh to his father's hut and stood still. The house his father had built that time had a compact structure that reminded him of a gnarled, dead tree stump, and gave a general appearance of ugliness and depression. The windows were small, and the wood almost black. The hut had been coated with such a heavy layer of tar that in the dusk it resembled more a withered root that had pushed its way up through the earth than a place you could call home. The villagers used to say that after his wife had died, Edric, Aaron's father, had poured all his pain and sorrow into building this house. But later it became clear to Aaron that his father's only aim had been to build a house that was completely wind-proof. He had succeeded in this, and Aaron was sure that his house was the warmest in the whole village. Secretly, though, he had to admit that the other villagers had a point. Aaron was young, but he already knew that there was more than one kind of coldness that could trouble a person. This brownish-black wooden fortress provided no refuge. Shivering inside, Aaron stopped studying the house and opened the door. It was no surprise that Aaron was still in bad form the following day. His father had reacted as expected and used his belt. Sitting was not an option now, and Aaron stole away from the house before his father thought of a more severe punishment than the wood-cutting he had been ordered to do. At least that could be done standing up. He walked smartly into the wood to cut branches off one of the marked trees. Falk, the forest guardian, hunted the woodland animals, but he also knew which trees could be felled without damaging the forest. Unlike the practice in other villages, the Deepstone villagers could not cut wood willy-nilly. The protection offered by the forest was too important, and so the woodcutters often went deep into the forest to fell the trees that Falk had specially marked. He had singled out a small group of trees the previous week, and Aaron made his way there. Even before he reached the clump of trees, he recognized the loud voices of Holken and his friends. Holken was the son of the local blacksmith and the strongest boy in the village. Aaron realized with a sigh that today was threatening to turn out even worse than yesterday. Although he wasn't particularly slight for his age, he certainly couldn't compete with that muscular bully. And for some reason, Holken always seemed to want to prove this. Naturally, this led the other boys in Holken's gang to see Aaron as nothing more than fair game. He avoided the blacksmith's son as much as possible, but this was probably not going to be possible today. The next nearest group of marked trees he knew of was half an hour's march away, and he would also have to carry the chopped wood back to the hut. So he would have to make the journey 4 or 5 times, laden down with wood. If he didn't want to double his workload, he would simply have to make use of the clump of trees in front of him. Just as he was about to move to within sight of the young gang, he heard a familiar voice in the undergrowth.
"Psst! Aaron! Over here!" "Lycus!"
Aaron nearly screamed with relief, but stopped himself at the last minute with a low-voiced exhalation. He gave a start, afraid that the gang had heard him, and with 2 quick steps to the left, he was behind the bushes where his best, and indeed only, friend was waiting. Lycus looked the same as ever, a half-smile in his narrow face and a cheeky sparkle in the blue eyes that flashed from under his black hair. Added to that, there was the dirty clothing, which had doubtless been new and pristine a few days earlier, but which was now torn in several places. No jerkin in the world could survive Lycus's propensity to crawl through the undergrowth and hide. Aaron himself was of a somewhat lean build and a typical Midlander with his nut-brown hair and green eyes, but compared to Lycus he was stocky and slow, because if Lycus was nothing else, he was certainly fast.
"I was hoping you'd come here today. I've been sitting in this bush for half an hour already, wondering how I can get my hands on firewood without having such backache tomorrow that I won't be able to stand," said Lycus in a low voice.
"How did you know I'd be coming here?" asked Aaron, surprised. Lycus smiled mischievously, and Aaron's face turned bright red. Of course, his father hadn't exactly been quiet the night before as he vented his feelings regarding his son's failings. Lycus's family were immediate neighbours and must have heard everything.
"Don't worry about it. Everyone can have a bad day. But you really do have to tell me later how it's possible to lose the fish, the flies, and the rod all in the one day without having been set upon by robbers," said Lycus with a chuckle. "Only the line, not the whole rod,"
said Aaron defensively, which only provoked the usual half-smile from his partner. Sometimes Aaron hated him for that grin. It seemed as if his wiry friend would meet every situation with this crooked smile, no matter how serious or awkward things became. One time Lycus had gone so far with his pranks that the bailiff had seriously considered dragging him before the village council. This was one of the most humiliating things that could befall a person in a community as small as Deepstone. Lycus had simply adopted this half-smile and begun to talk the bailiff out of his plan. Half an hour later he was let go. Old Mara, who had seen the whole thing, had said to Aaron, "That young boy has a gift, no doubt about it. In 10 years he'll either be sitting on the village council himself, or he'll have been banished." She had shaken her head kind-heartedly as she watched Lycus scampering away. I see, just a fishing line. Then it's not so bad. That could happen to anyone," said the wiry boy, referring teasingly to Aaron's misfortune. "Just leave it, will you? I'll tell you everything later," Aaron responded, giving in. He knew his friend would give him no peace anyway if he didn't. The word curiosity took on a whole new meaning when you were in Lycus's company. Maybe, thought Aaron, that was why he combined stealth and chattering so well. What the merchant's son couldn't find out through cajoling, he did through stealth. Yet he never used this acquired knowledge to his own advantage. Yes, he got up to tricks, but he never harmed anyone unless he was forced into a corner. Maybe that's why he got away with so much, thought Aaron to himself. He said to Lycus, "But first I need firewood, and preferably without being nabbed by Holcon. 2 beatings in 2 days are just too much," and with a grimace he rubbed his backside. "That's exactly what I thought too when I saw Hammerhead here," said Lycus. Hammerhead was a nickname he had invented for the budding apprentice blacksmith because he was firmly of the opinion that the big bully wouldn't need a hammer for his handiwork. His head would do just as good a job. It was of no use for anything else anyway. The fact that Holcon really did possess a somewhat angular head just added insult to injury. Lycus relished picking the right words and thereby really infuriating the target of his scorn. Not that he was ever brought to book in this regard. Lycus was small and slight, but beside his ability to be stealthy, he was also the best sprinter in the village and used his surroundings artfully to his benefit. Any time he was in imminent danger of being eventually hunted down and caught, he would find refuge among several sympathetic villagers. He would have plausibly convinced them that it was certainly not his fault that at that moment he was being chased by a gang of ruffians. This was just as well, Aaron thought to himself, for Holcon would certainly tear the younger boy apart if he ever caught him. Aaron valued his friend for these very reasons. His sharp humour, his quick-wittedness, and, of course, his fleet-footedness, which saved him from the consequences of the other 2 qualities, were a combination of all the things lacking in Aaron. For some reason his hands and feet were always getting in the way, and even if he never considered himself to be stupid, he never had the courage or the presence of mind to find the right words at the right time. Now Lycus was grinning at him and formulating his plan on how they could get to the firewood as quickly as possible without having to do the heavy work themselves or without falling into the hands of the other youngsters. "It's really very simple," he whispered. "I'll lure them away from the clearing, and you grab the firewood. Hammerhead is so hell-bent on getting his hands on me that he'll give chase as soon as he sees me. The other idiots will follow him for fear of getting a tongue-lashing if they don't help, and then I'll give him the slip." "Yes, that sounds great. Let's go," agreed Aaron enthusiastically. The thought of not having to spend hours on end cutting wood, but of snatching the fruit of the others' hard-earned labour appealed to Aaron so much that he agreed without giving it a second thought. Yesterday's misfortune had wounded him deeply, and the thought of outwitting the world in general, and the village boys in particular, seemed to him in his present state of mind to be poetic justice. "Good. Get into position over there and grab the wood as soon as they're all gone. Best bring it to Safehold. It's not so far, and you can easily hide there." Safehold was a treehouse the two boys had built the previous summer. Falk was the only other person who knew about it. The pair had asked him about a suitable tree because they wanted to be sure that their treehouse wouldn't be chopped down one fine day. "Sure, I'll do it. Just be careful nobody catches you." "They haven't managed it yet," chuckled Lycus, and disappeared among the trees.
"That's exactly what worries me,"
muttered Aaron, and stared at the place where he had just seen his friend. The day would come when fortune wouldn't smile on the crafty boy, and then it could end in tears. Already Lycus's plan didn't seem like such a good idea to him. But his nimble friend was already gone, and Aaron crept into the undergrowth with an uneasy feeling in his stomach. He pushed himself into the designated position, and had to admire Lycus's trained eye in such matters. From here he had a good view of the cluster of trees in question, and of the 4 youths toiling away without being seen himself. As long as he didn't draw attention to himself with sudden movements, he'd be able to lie here unnoticed for a good while. He contemplated the scene before him. Holken dominated the picture, of course, with his bulging muscles rippling under his sweaty skin as he worked on the thickest branches with forceful swings of the axe. With a derogatory snort, Aaron observed that the show-off had taken off his shirt so that he could be admired more. He did this for the benefit of the 4 other youngsters. Besides, Holken was the eldest in the clearing, so the others looked up to him anyway. Aaron was almost sick with envy as he watched them joking around. He'd have given anything to be part of their group, instead of having been chosen to be a whipping boy by a stupid twist of fate. Maybe that's why he couldn't stand Holken. Before he could give this any further thought, Lycus darted into the clearing, grabbed a few thin branches from the impressive pile that the 5 had already cut, and crowed a merry "Thanks, you snails!" to the stunned onlookers, only to disappear again into the undergrowth. Aaron suppressed a laugh with difficulty, and pressed himself hard into the ground to avoid being spotted. "Right! He's done for! Grab him!" screamed Holken, his face red, and he and the others gave chase to the timber-snatcher. That was almost too easy, thought Aaron, as he slipped towards the clearing, after giving the mob a few seconds to head off. With his heart pounding, and with sweaty hands, but also with a wonderful feeling of exhilaration in his stomach, he strode quickly into the clearing and grabbed a big bundle of firewood. He quickly piled as much wood into his arms as possible until he almost collapsed under the weight, and stumbled into the undergrowth, fearful that he would hear a scornful cry or feel a hard fist in his back. With relief he realized that neither had happened, and after a short trot he reached Safehold. Panting, he hid the wood in nearby shrubbery and looked up at the one place in which he had really felt comfortable in his young years. As always, he was filled with pride when he looked at the wooden construction, well hidden and studded with twigs, 5 paces high, concealed in the tree's thick foliage. In reality, Safehold was a wooden box 3 paces by 3, nestled in the crown of the tree and only visible through keen observation. The tree itself was 10 paces high, with expansive branches, and carried the additional weight effortlessly, even in stormy weather. Falk had helped them with the complicated knots, and lent them the hoist with which the youngsters had lifted the wood into the crown of the tree, but generally they had built it completely by themselves. Aaron would never have thought that the forest guardian would have been so supportive, but it seemed he understood their yearning for a hiding place, and with a lot of patience and good advice he had given them regular feedback on their progress. Frowning, Aaron thought back to the knots Falk had made to tie the main beams together. Although both Aaron and Lycus had watched carefully, neither could say with any certainty how exactly these knots were tied, and a thorough examination of them, after Falk was finished, hadn't shed any light on the matter. It almost seemed as though the knots had only one end, but that was surely only because of the clever binding. When Aaron asked him once about it, a thin but warm smile appeared on the guardian's leathery face, and he only said, "Every craft has its secrets, and this one is mine." The youngster wanted to climb the tree now. They had deliberately done without a ladder so as not to endanger the secret location of their refuge, when a daring thought came into his head. Why not make another trip to the clearing? There was a good chance he would be able to take the same amount of wood again. Then the two friends would have a considerable amount of wood to boast of, and the others would end up completely empty-handed. If he was going to risk it, he'd have to be quick. Without hesitating, he started heading back. It wasn't long before the pile of wood was in sight again. A quick look confirmed that no one was there. Aaron picked up the rest of the wood with a triumphant grin, when suddenly Holcomb leapt into the clearing, roaring furiously. "You! I should have known that you and that little weasel were in cahoots. I'm going to give you such a belt in the face you'll remember it every time you look in the mirror." Aaron was frozen to the spot, but his mind was racing. Holcomb must have lain in wait for Lycus, hoping to pounce on the nimble youngster if he came back, which was a surprisingly subtle tactic for a muscle man like him. But Lycus had been far too clever to fall for something like that. "Unlike me," thought Aaron dryly, as he flung the wood at his opponent and spun round on his heels. There were maybe 3 paces between them, and Aaron's heart was in his mouth. He started running towards Safehold as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind him, both left and right, he could hear scornful shouting as well as the crashing of branches and twigs. The others must be right on his heels. It would end in disaster. Terrified, Aaron sprinted on through the wood. He could barely breathe. The roots of the trees were treacherous. One false move could be his undoing, and then he'd really be in for it. He ran on aimlessly through the wood for some minutes, trying to escape from the bloodhound's field of vision. He may not have had Lycus's natural talents, but he had certainly learnt from his friend. Low-lying branches whipped his forearms as he protected his face, and he could feel his breath beginning to burn in his chest. The cries of the chasers were still close behind, and the young boy knew he'd better not slow down, even though he was beginning to see black spots before his eyes. Hurriedly he searched for a hiding place or some indication of his present location. He could see a fallen oak tree in front of him. Its bare crown was being held up by 2 healthy trees, forming a sort of knotty ramp. With a joyful yelp, he began half climbing, half running up the oak's rough bark until he arrived among the leaves of the other trees, and then fought his way through the crown of the tree towards the right. The others were also clambering up and shouting threats, thinking they had trapped him. But Aaron remembered the spot, having been there often enough with Lycus. If you weren't being chased by an angry mob, you could have great fun climbing around the treetops. The additional branches of the fallen oak offered countless opportunities for holding on. To put it simply, it was a wonderful playground. Aaron climbed higher and higher into the crown of the tree and moved to the other side of it, and in his hurry, as well as because of his increasing tiredness, he grazed himself in several places, on his hands, his elbows, and his knees. He prayed that none of them knew this spot, because it had one peculiarity. There was a little pond within reaching distance of the tree on the right, as long as you sprang from one particular branch. Actually, it was perfectly safe. The distance wasn't great. But Aaron was tired. His knees were shaking, and he could hardly breathe. He pulled himself onto the wide branch that always served as his jumping-off point, paused for a second in order to look down at the dark, murky pond water at least 10 paces below him. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed that the others were slowly clambering up the oak, turning their heads in search of him with their faces grimacing and full of scorn. It looked as if they'd lost sight of him among the leaves. This was his chance. Aaron took one more deep breath, filling his lungs with as much air as possible, and threw himself off. His tired legs protested, and his jump was far from perfect. He flew through the air at an angle so that he landed in the water on his side. The left side of his body burned like fire. The abrasions and little cuts he had picked up as he had fled stung unmercifully, and he was also winded. He thrashed about rather than swam until he finally reached the surface. Breathing heavily, he looked back at the tree, then at the opposite bank, which was edged with low reeds. Clearly the others hadn't noticed him disappear. With a little luck, he could vanish among the trees before anyone spotted him. He swam quietly to the bank and had just pulled himself onto dry land when he heard a chorus of surprise behind him. Aaron stumbled away. He was simply too tired to run any faster, but still managed to build up a sufficient lead so that his chasers couldn't see him any more. It seemed as though none of the bloodhounds were willing to take the shortcut through the pond, which meant they had to clamber back down again. Feeling himself to be safe now, he made his way towards Safehold and prayed that the village boys would soon tire of the chase. He realized with relief that they too had run out of energy. Their angry calls some distance away indicated that he had maintained his lead. After a short jog, Aaron, gasping for breath, touched the tree trunk, his place of safety. If the tree house had only been 100 paces further on, he would probably never have reached it in time. With one last effort, he heaved himself up into the safety of the den, lay flat on the floor, and tried to bring his breathing under control. His legs felt like rubber as he was sure he couldn't take another step. As the noise of his chasers came closer, he turned on his tummy with a suppressed groan and peeked through a gap in the branches. One after another, 3 of the angry boys ran under his hiding place. After a few seconds, he could hear confused and angry cries. They realized that their prey had given them the slip. "He must be here somewhere," shouted Holken, and stopped barely 6 paces away from Safehold. "He must have hidden himself. Look for him!" Cursing silently, Aaron watched how the boys began searching through undergrowth and in the trees for him. What had he got himself into? Now they'd find the tree-house too. Aaron closed his eyes and held his breath, hoping that the camouflage would fool the boys. "Look! There's the firewood! He must be very near!" shouted one of them. A feeling of hopelessness overcame Aaron. He saw Holken staring over at the pile of wood before beginning to search everything meticulously. The others followed his example, and Aaron scolded himself silently. He should have put down the bundle of wood further away, or at least hidden it better. Terrified, he watched the commotion below him. Even if the boys were to give up, he thought it would be wise to stay put until the gang had calmed down. He hadn't forgotten the threat Holken had uttered in the clearing, and he was in no mood to lose a few teeth by running into him on his way home. After a while, Sven went over to Holken and whispered something into his ear. The miller's son was no danger on his own, and even rather quiet and shy, but he had the habit of pitching in if his victim was incapable of offering any more resistance. Holken never got carried away like that, but the unwritten rules of the village boys meant nothing to chubby Sven. It was rumoured that even the village elders had discussed the miller's son's bad behaviour. Aaron saw the coldness in the eyes of the miller's son from the tree-house, and a shiver ran down his spine. Meanwhile, a smirk appeared on Holken's coarse face as he listened to his companion's suggestion. "Come here, boys. We'll head back. Sven thinks he knows where we'll find Aaron's sneaky little friend. Then we'll give him his due." They gathered together the stolen firewood again and disappeared into the forest as they headed for the clearing. Aaron was terrified of what the boys had planned. What should he do? On the one hand, he didn't want to leave his friend in the lurch, but on the other hand, he just didn't have the courage to climb down and to surrender to the village boys. The adults were too far away, and he had angered Håkon too much. And anyway, there was Sven and his cold eyes. He always had the most vicious ideas, not to mention excellent powers of observation. If anyone could root out Lycus's hiding places, then it was him. Aaron sat there for a while as if spellbound, and feverishly considered his options. He was torn between self-preservation and loyalty. The scene kept flashing in front of his eyes. Lycus discovered in one of his hiding places by the angry mob. Horrified, he imagined what Sven would do with Lycus once he had the chance to act out his darker impulses with nobody stopping him. Suddenly he was more afraid of the miller's son than of all the other boys put together. "You can come down now, they're gone." The deep growling voice sounded from below. Aaron couldn't believe his ears. Folk! Relief came over him like a wave. Peeking down over the edge of the treehouse, he recognized the weather-beaten face of the forest guardian. He was casually leaning against the tree trunk and looking up at him. The boy hadn't been aware of his approach. Nobody in the village could hear Falk if Falk didn't want them to. He made an impressive appearance, dressed as always in buckskin garments, with the long bow over his shoulder and the hunting knife on his belt. Weapons of any sort being something of a rarity in the little village. The tall, broad-shouldered frame of the forest guardian, with his closely cropped grey hair and full beard, completed the picture. A few heartbeats passed by, with Aaron not daring to move. He simply stared at Falk until the latter finally boomed from below, "Now, come on down! Some of us here still need to earn a living." Groaning and red-faced, Aaron clambered down the tree and looked up at the forest guardian with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. How much had he witnessed? Falk eyed him with a serious face and a questioning look. "And? Everything all right with you?" Aaron nodded, but his opposite number's face darkened noticeably. "What did they want from you? That didn't look like the usual teasing. Håkon might be a ruffian, but today they were really angry." "Well, actually it was really quite harmless. Lycus and I just stole a bit of firewood from them, that's all." Aaron was trying to defend himself. "Firewood? You stole it? I must be hearing things. You were too lazy to cut some for yourselves, and you robbed them of the fruits of their labour. No wonder they want to give you a hiding." Shaking his head, Falk looked down at him with a serious look. "Even if they often cause trouble, at least they've done their work and been diligent. Two things that can't be said about you, if you ask me." During his short sermon, Falk's voice was growing louder and Aaron's face redder. His voice shaking with remorse, he could only utter a simple, "I'm sorry." Falk had always been friendly towards him, and the fact that he was furious about something Aaron had done weighed heavily on the boy. The forest guardian's summary of the events was right, of course, which only made it worse. "What? Do you mean you're only sorry when you're caught letting others do your work while you skive off? The apprenticeship tests are next week. Which master craftsman or woman will pick you as an apprentice now?" Aaron winced, and the old man continued, "And by the way, those boys you were stealing from are the sons of the miller, the blacksmith, the fisherwoman, the seamstress, and the dyer. 5 bosses who will on no account take you on. Lycus will start as an apprentice with his father. He doesn't need to give it a second thought, but you—" Falk didn't finish the sentence, but Aaron could imagine the rest. His father had played his last sympathy card within the village a long time ago due to his constant drunkenness, And as he was only a labourer on Trell's farm, he couldn't train Aaron. Not that the young boy would have wanted it. The gaunt farmer Trell, who had more cows on his large farm than any of the other villagers, didn't employ apprentices either, and paid all his workers an equally miserly wage. And with the best will in the world, like as his father, the only merchant in the village, really didn't need 2 apprentices. So if Aaron was to learn a trade, he was dependent on one of the village master craftsmen and women. If news got out of what he'd done, even if it was only seen as a prank, he might be turned down by all of them.
"Master Fulk,
he began, but the big man cut him off with a terse gesture. "All right, I won't say anything. The others will spread the story around anyway, but they're only young boys. If you're lucky, you might just get a few disapproving looks. I know your father. I know it isn't easy for you, but if it happens again, I will personally mark this tree here and then fell it. Is that clear?" Fulk's piercing grey eyes now resembled 2 freezing mountain lakes, and Aaron's heart became even heavier.
"Yes,"
Aaron swallowed.
"Thank you for your understanding."
"Oh, I don't understand your behaviour. But if I were to report you to the council, you wouldn't learn any more from your mistake, would you?" the forest guardian growled. "And bear this in mind," he said. "For the sake of 2 armfuls of firewood, you're now covered in grazes and cuts and probably aching muscles as well. Also, your clothing is ripped. That'll probably take you 2 hours to mend, not to mention the load of trouble you're going to have with those other boys. If you'd just stuck to cutting your own wood, you'd only have the aching muscles." Taken aback, Aaron stared at the older man. This sober analysis made him realize how stupid and pointless his prank had been.
"I'd be better off going and cutting my own firewood,"
said Aaron, trying to get out of the conversation. Any more of Fulk's unvarnished truths, and he'd burst into tears. The last time that happened was years ago. His father had taught him one thing, at least. Tears never helped. And anyway, thankful as he was that the forest guardian had protected him, he had a tiring day of wood chopping ahead of him and had to hurry if he wanted to be finished by evening. "I don't want to renew my acquaintance with father's belt," he thought to himself. "That's the right attitude." Fulk nodded, pacified once more. "Don't forget today's lesson. I've lost the track of a magnificent buck, and I don't want that to have happened for nothing." The forest guardian turned and prepared to disappear into the undergrowth, but then he hesitated and turned around again to face the cowed youngster. "It's strange that the boys chased you so deep into the forest and are looking for your friend now. It seems a little drastic, especially as they have their wood again," he continued. Aaron knew what the forest guardian meant. Even if the blacksmith's son was the undisputed king of the village boys and a complete ruffian, trouble with him would only ever amount to a few scuffles. A song and dance like this wasn't his way of operating.
"It was Sven. He goaded Håkon on,"
Aaron replied, remembering when the situation had escalated. "Well, that would explain it. Much as I don't want to get involved, I'm going to have to talk to his father," grumbled Fulk, and without another word he turned again and disappeared into the thicket. Thanks to his camouflaged clothing, he was invisible after a few steps. A silence descended on the clearing, leaving a thoughtful, crestfallen young boy who had a mountain of work ahead of him. Aaron spent the rest of the day chopping wood and lugging it to his father's hut. His whole body ached, his cuts burnt like fire every time sweat ran down them, and he was so tired he could hardly walk straight. While he worked, he pondered over the morning's happenings and the forest guardian. This distracted him from the physical pain and helped him to keep going. Falk was not known for involving himself in village matters. He had been living in the eastern forest for as long as Aaron could remember, but nobody knew much about him, except that he was a blow-in, which in a village like Deepstone meant anyone who wasn't at least third generation there. The forest guardian lived off the beaten track in the woods, liked to keep himself to himself, and lived by the motto, "Live and let live." Hardly anyone in the village took any notice of him, except for 4 years earlier, when for once he was the talk of the village. One of the 5 seats on the council had become vacant, and he was offered the position. He had recently killed a particularly large fog cat called Grey Fang, who had been a danger to the village. There was great consternation when the forest guardian turned down the offer, as no one remembered anyone rejecting this honour before. Since that time, this silent man was left to go about his work unhindered, and they respected his solitary way of life. The villagers considered him austere and serious, so Aaron was doubly grateful for what he had done for him today. Panting, Aaron dropped a heavy branch on the woodpile behind the house and went into the wood once more. He had picked a tree far away from this morning's clearing, and so the journey was twice as long. The sun was low now, but he still had to bring back 2 more branches. He could cut them up into smaller pieces tomorrow. His mind wandered to the apprenticeship tests that would be taking place the following week. His prospects really weren't good, and he had tried not to think about it for as long as possible. These tests were held every year among the 13-year-olds of the village. This made it possible to determine who would be suitable for one of the available trades. The master craftsmen and women might be looking for an apprentice or might wish to promote a particular talent. Being an apprentice had many advantages. You got a little apprentice money, you were allowed to drink alcohol, could go to dances, and of course you learned the basics with which you could make a name for yourself later. After some time you could work as a journeyman or even become a master craftsman. Plus you belonged to the apprentices, no longer to the everyday village boys. Then Aaron would be free of his adversaries. Nobody messed with an apprentice, out of respect for the master. No one knew yet which masters had registered their need for an apprentice with Keeper Jigral, the village priest. Lycus was 13 too, so he would go to the test with Aaron, but it went without saying that his own father, Merchant Vellum, would take him on. Holcomb, too, would be standing in the village square next week, but it was equally certain that his father wouldn't officially apply and simply claim him as an apprentice during the ritual. Making a claim in this way was frowned upon, as it meant circumventing the suitability test. There would be no risk of another candidate endangering the chances of your child getting the apprenticeship. Lycus's father, on the other hand, believed his son had to earn the position. As he was a traditionalist, he made an official search, which didn't stop him from preparing Lycus as thoroughly as possible beforehand. That left only Rufus and Aaron as genuine candidates, as no girls were applying this year. Aaron could only hope that at least 2 more master craftsmen or women would officially register a search. Of course, it wasn't certain that a master who registered would necessarily pick one of the apprentices, but there was a very good chance, as long as you didn't reveal yourself to be hopelessly inadequate in the relevant trade. If you came away empty-handed, you'd be hired by one of the farms or businesses, from where it was almost impossible to get one of the desired apprenticeships. Deepstone was simply too small. Some of the disappointed candidates moved away in order to find work for themselves in a strange place, but most of them moved back within a short time. It was no better in the other villages. A few went off to the big towns, for example 3 Rivers, and were never heard of again. A last resort was the army, but the recruiters were notorious for paying a miserable wage. Hjalgar didn't have a traditional standing army. The country was simply too small and surrounded by powerful kingdoms. No one wanted to end up a soldier. One look at the dilapidated border stations and the bored faces of the few soldiers with their dull eyes, and you understood exactly how the proverb, useless as a Hjalgar soldier, came about. The fact that the small country in the Eastern Midlands had never been seized was down to its peculiar location. It was a buffer zone between the three kingdoms of the Midlands, and none of its neighbours dared to invade, as that would immediately start a war with Hjalgar's two other neighbouring states. No one wanted this area to fall into the hands of the other, and so Hjalgar had remained one of the safest places on the whole continent for the previous 300 years. Also, because it had no army, and so proved no threat. Lost in thought, Aaron brought the last heavy branch to the hut, and admired the sizable pile of firewood. Then he went in to prepare supper so his father's mood wouldn't worsen. The next few days flew by. Lycus burst into laughter when his friend told him about his little adventure with Håkon and his gang, and he dismissed Aaron's worries about him. Of course, the wiry boy had had all the time in the world to safely bring his share of the wood from the clearing to the merchant's hut, and he had spent the rest of the day in one of his secluded hideaways on the river, hoping that Aaron would turn up again. Sven couldn't frighten the feisty young boy. In fact, he wasn't fit to hold a candle to him. The two friends enjoyed themselves with all sorts of silliness, knowing full well that the carefree days of their childhood would be over forever once they had completed the apprenticeship test. The children of the village only had to do a few jobs, and usually had the full day to do them. If they completed whatever they'd been given to do quickly, then they had a lot of time to play. This would all change the following week. Lycus was excited, and his eyes shone when he talked about his forthcoming apprenticeship in the merchant's shop, while Aaron pondered his uncertain future. One afternoon the two friends were walking along, deep in conversation, on the main street towards the village square, when Lycus tapped Aaron on the shoulder. With a wink and a little nod he indicated to his friend that he should look around discreetly. Casually turning his head in the direction his wiry friend had suggested, he quickly understood what his friend had noticed. A familiar muscular back could clearly be seen protruding over the rough picket fence of one of the many vegetable patches found beside almost every house in Deepstone. Håkon, it seemed, was trying to stalk them. "Well, hiding isn't one of his strong points," Lycus whispered quietly. Then he added loudly, "Am I glad I'm not in Håkon's shoes? His father's been looking for him for ages, called him a lazybones, and is really furious. If Hammerhead doesn't make an appearance soon, he'll be in for a real hiding." Suppressing giggles, the pair leaned against the wall of a hut, clearly visible but at a safe distance from Håkon's hiding place, and pretended to be engaged in a quiet conversation. In reality, however, they were watching the ruffian with glee as he became increasingly nervous in his hiding place. Finally, the big boy jumped up and ran towards the blacksmith's, his face a picture of fear, while the two friends doubled over with laughter before running from the scene. They wanted to be gone before Håkon realized he had fallen for one of Lycus's tricks again. The blacksmith's son never stalked them again. 2 days before the test, Aaron and Lycus were lying on the river bank, their fishing rods in the water. The weather reflected Aaron's mood. Dark clouds moved across the skies, the sun occasionally breaking through for a moment. "Lycus?" "Yes?" "Is it known at this stage which master craftsmen and women have registered a search?" asked Aaron, his voice a mixture of hope and fear. "Father proclaimed his quest to the keeper today, and he also asked who else had visited the priest, at my request." Lycus looked mischievously at his friend and continued, "Master Pragur and Mistress Dolman were there. I don't think anyone else will turn up." Mistress Dolman was the village shoemaker. It was true that Aaron had nothing in particular against shoes, and the mistress had a good reputation. But he was also aware that Rufus was very poor at sewing, so the selection wouldn't favour him. But Aaron, too, was clumsy with his fingers. Anyway, Aaron knew which master he wanted to impress. Pragur was namely the village bailiff. A bailiff, yes, being a bailiff was something Aaron could easily live with. Everyone respected you, and your armour was made from cured leather. You also had a short sword and a truncheon. You trained with those weapons, and only the village council could set aside your rulings. Bailiffs enforced law and order and chased away bandits and other riffraff. A bailiff was a hero in Hjalgar, or at least what was the nearest thing to a hero in Hjalgar. As he lay on the river bank, Aaron imagined himself outdoing Rufus in the apprenticeship test, and eventually being picked by Pragur. That man was one of the few people in Deepstone who had time for Aaron. He was often called upon to lay down the law whenever Aaron's father became too loud. The peacekeeper was always friendly and compassionate to the young boy on these occasions. If he were to become a bailiff aspirant, he himself could perhaps make a stand against his father. This thought put Aaron into the best of moods. Lycus prodded him in the side. "And? What do you think, shoemaker or bailiff?" Bailiff would be great," said Aaron. "All I have to do is beat Rufus in Pragur's test. He isn't particularly strong or fast, so I should be able to manage it." "Oh, yes, you as a bailiff. Then you could always keep an eye on our shop, and your father would have to be nicer to you." The two friends began building castles in the air, and by the time the midday sun had won its battle with the clouds, they were imagining themselves as town council members leading Deepstone towards a glorious future. It was the evening before the summer solstice, the day when the apprenticeship tests were traditionally held, and Aaron was so excited that he could hardly sit still at the supper table. Again and again he imagined his triumphal election to bailiff, persuaded himself that he alone was the correct choice, that Pragur had taken to him kindly, that his father, dark rings around his eyes and no longer quite sober, growled, "Stop fidgeting, boy. Tomorrow you'll be able to do your bit for our livelihood at last. I've had a word with Trell. You can work on his farm for £0.50 a week and give me a hand. Good news, isn't it?" Aaron froze. All his images of the following day vanished in front of his eyes. But the test tomorrow," he began. "Yes, what about it?" his father interrupted. "Do you think anyone will take you on with all the mistakes you keep making? You're useless as a fisherman, your shoulders aren't broad enough for heavy labour, and you're always in a world of your own. Just be thankful that I'm able to get you onto Trell's farm without fuss, so at least you'll be spared the humiliation of not being selected by anyone." The matter-of-fact way in which Aaron's father shattered his dreams filled him with a feeling of hopelessness. Not only was he condemned to working beside his father, but he'd be working for a pittance as well. The thought of having to spend days and years in his father's company horrified him, but this made him bolder than usual. "And what about the position of bailiff?" he ventured. "I suppose you think you're better than I am. I get a job for you, and this is my thanks. If the work is good enough for me, then it's good enough for you. You're coming to the farm with me tomorrow and beginning your new job, understood?" The threatening undertone in his father's voice made it clear that any objection would result in a beating. But Aaron didn't care, not this time, not with these terrible pictures in his head of himself, broken, sitting beside his father with a pitcher in front of him, both waiting in cold silence with bitter looks on their faces. waiting for another day of endless, monotonous work. Aaron was nearly in a state of panic. "I'm going to be in the fairground tomorrow, and I'm going to take part in the test and become a bailiff, and then you can look for someone else you can let off steam at." No sooner were the words out of his mouth when Aaron recoiled. One look at his father, and he knew he'd gone too far, much too far. "Let off steam!" he roared. "I'll show you what letting off steam is." He threw over the table with a crash and grabbed his belt. "If he catches me now," the boy thought, horrified, "I won't be able to go tomorrow, never mind pass the test, and I'll spend the rest of my life here." His eyes bulging with fear, he rushed to the door and pushed the heavy latch to the side. His father locked the door with it every evening, and normally Aaron found it very difficult to push the heavy latch aside. But now he was possessed by a hot, wild panic, and with his first attempt it slipped open. Feverishly he tried to evade his father's drunken fingers while simultaneously opening the door. The whole hut suddenly seemed even darker and more threatening than before. The tar that filled in the joints seemed to be stretching out in an attempt to pen him into the house. He had just managed to open the door widely enough to slip out when his father's hand grasped his arm and yanked him back inside. With a triumphant yell, the drunken man pulled his own arm backwards, holding the belt ready to chastise his son. "He's not even looking at where he's going to lash me," Aaron realized in shock. It was clear to him that the leather belt would hit his face. In a flash, he raised his arm, and with a loud slap, the leather strap hit his left hand. Aaron heard a crunching noise as a fiery red pain shot through his wrist. His father raised his arm again, only to slip on a plate that had fallen to the ground with the table and tumbled to the floor. "The three be thanked!" Aaron thanked his lucky stars, gathered himself up, and, quick as a flash, disappeared into the forest. The coarse insults of his father rang in his ears as he pushed his way through the undergrowth, scratching his skin all over, and ran to the only safe place he could think of, his treehouse, his safe hold. The cries of his progenitor grew ever fainter, but the final babbling, tortured cry would remain with him forever. "It's your fault! You're the reason she's dead!" This cry echoed long through the night in Aaron's ears as he lay in a ball in his treehouse, his injured hand pressed against his chest, sobbing uncontrollably for a mother he had never known, but whose death he had caused, however unwittingly. Chapter 2. Midsummer's Day began in glorious sunshine, which provided a ceremonious invitation to the festivities. Every self-respecting person was there, spending the day mingling on the village square with the other villagers. The village innkeeper served beer, and the miller's wife offered her famous little cakes, which were so tasty that it was rumoured the miller had only married her on account of these little delicacies. A look at the miller's portly figure and the plain features of his wife only added credibility to the rumour. The centre of the village community was dominated on one side by an enormous oak tree, whose heavy branches offered protection and shade. Deepstone's vast warehouse dominated the other side. The communal village supplies were stored there, and it also served as temporary accommodation for festivities such as this. The two other sides of the village square were lined by the most important buildings in the community. Here you could find the tavern, the forge, the grocer's, the village hall, and, of course, the village chapel. It was the only building made of white stone, and it dominated the area. All the houses surrounding the square had been festooned with cloth garlands that morning, and these were fluttering colourfully in the breeze. The village hall was the only two-storied building on the north side of the square, and with its hard-packed clay walls it lent the scene a certain grandeur. Apprenticeship Day was always filled with laughter. Stories of past apprenticeship tests were told, and the merits of the new candidates compared. One or two even placed bets on the possible outcomes of the day ahead, although this was officially prohibited by the village council. Everyone was finely dressed, in clothes they would otherwise only wear on the days of the gods, when they would stream into the chapel to listen to Keeper Jegrol's prayer service. And indeed, here he stood now, in full regalia on the festively decorated square, chatting with the council members before striding to the centre. 3 tall poles were rammed into the earth, on top of which were 3 wooden flags, the symbols of the respective guilds. On the first pole was a wheel with 12 spokes, a symbol of the 12 trading towns that were scattered around the whole continent, and that made up the Merchants' Council. The second flag displayed a leather hunting boot with spurs, in front of a stylized coat of arms. These shoes were only worn by the nobility, and only a guild shoemaker had permission to make them. And last, but not least, a short sword in front of the locked town gate, the bailiff's sign, which stood for protection and order. The priest turned around and recited the opening formula. "May he who moulds hold his guiding hand over this apprenticeship test, and show to all what sort of people he has created out of the young members of this village. May the inner form he has given them enrich our community, and may it bring to light today which calling they each should follow." His tunic, woven from shimmer silk, glittered in all the colours of the rainbow, and lent the thin, bald man with the friendly eyes the impression of constant movement. Every time Keeper Jegrol moved, and the colours were rolling like waves over his regalia, changing ever so slightly. Spellbound by the interplay of form and colour within the robe, even the smallest children remained still when they saw the traditional clothing of the priest. "May the young men now step forward to give the future of this village a new shape." The 3 boys stepped forward, all in their best clothes. As if underlining the priest's words, they were quite different from each other in appearance and demeanour, as though the gods of forms was showing the gathering how varied mankind could be. But Aaron was nowhere to be seen. Lycus was cloaked in feast-day clothing, which displayed the colours of the Merchants' Guild, yellow on blue. He stood there, small and slight, and glanced around with a worried look. His friend not turning up couldn't be good, and of course he'd heard the uproar the previous night and was now greatly worried. Holcon was standing beside him, his big, brawny frame forced into a robe much too small for him, and which he was wearing with obvious discomfort. And finally Rufus, with his nondescript face, stood shyly in simple but clean clothing. The clergyman looked at the 3 youths with surprise. "Well now, where is Aaron? There should be 4 boys here ready to show the world their form." A snort could be heard from the beer-stand. Edric, who was celebrating in his own way and was already quite tipsy, shouted, "The young boy won't be coming. He'll be starting tomorrow as a labourer on Trell's farm." With these words, a murmur rippled through the crowd, while Lycus gasped in shock. An embarrassed Trell, meanwhile, stepped from one foot to the other. The gaunt landowner wasn't very popular anyway, and he really didn't want to play an unwitting part in this little scandal.
"Oh, well then, if he's already made his decision, I don't want to stand in the way of the moulder's decision."
Piqued that his ceremony had been thrown into disorder, Jegrol was just about to continue when unrest broke out on the fringes of the crowd. It was Aaron who pushed his way through the crowd until, quite out of breath, he positioned himself beside Lycus. He was filthy, full of badly healed scratches, and his left hand was terribly swollen. He had woken up late from an exhausted sleep, and with a pounding pain in his hand he had dragged himself to the village square. His friend looked at him anxiously. "Did a carter's wagon roll over you?" Lycus followed Aaron's eyes as he looked meaningfully at his father, who had made himself comfortable at the beer-stand. Edric examined his son with a suspicious look, and Lycus murmured, "I understand." The villagers had recovered from their initial shock and were now whispering intently among themselves. Annoyance at the boy's unseemly conduct was mixed with pity. A feeling of cold contempt began to spread for a man who hated his son so much that he would shame him in public.
"He who moulds will now accompany these young men to achieving manhood. May out of them be moulded men of whom we may be proud," intoned Keeper Jigral, trying to keep the ceremony on the right track. "Which master today seeks the advice of the moulder?"
Lycus's father stepped forward.
"Master Vellum seeks a boy who can be moulded into a merchant."
At which point he looked steadfastly at his son and gave him a wink. Then it was the shoemaker's turn.
"Mistress Dolman seeks a boy who can be moulded into a shoemaker."
And finally the bailiff stepped forward.
"Master Pragur seeks a boy who can be moulded into a bailiff."
Jigral made the sign of the three in front of each of them and continued,
"The masters and the mistress may step forward and present their tests."
With measured steps the two masters and the mistress stepped forward and positioned themselves behind their respective guild signs. In unison they muttered the ritual, "May he who moulds guide our process." At this point Lycus's father stepped forward. "As merchants, you must master the art of counting, so I shall give each of you 3 problems you must solve." With a few short words he gave each of the boys 3 sums to solve. It quickly became clear that Lycus was the mathematical genius in the group, as he answered all his questions quickly and correctly. Aaron needed a little longer, but he was surprised to see that he too could answer all the questions. Lycus had helped him, of course, when they'd practiced together. Every answer was a struggle for Holcon, while Rufus could only answer one question. Yet he didn't seem too bothered. Lycus's father turned to Keeper Jigral. "The boys Aaron and Lycus can be moulded into merchants," the priest responded.
"Which should be your apprentice, so that he may be finally moulded into a merchant?"
The merchant gave Aaron an apologetic look and said, "The boy Lycus should be a merchant, by the mercy of the moulder." A cheer rose up from the crowd of villagers, even if the outcome of the choice had never been in doubt. Everyone had assumed Lycus would be next in line, and today's ceremony was simply a formality that needed to be observed.
"Then, apprentice, take your place by the side of your master,"
Jigral intoned, and Lycus, brimming with joy, went over to stand beside his father, who looked at him proudly as he positioned himself under the merchant's symbol. When Aaron saw this, his heart sank, and he almost broke down. He stole a glance at the beer-stand, and saw his father staring listlessly into space. A pity that the innkeeper wasn't recruiting this year, thought Aaron. After years of experience, the boy could tell by looking at anyone how much beer they would tolerate before falling asleep. This black humour helped to cheer him up. He smiled sincerely at his best friend, who beamed at him with joy. Then Mistress Dolman stepped forward. "As a shoemaker, you have to be skilled with your hands, and know how to handle the leather correctly. Each of you will now, to the best of your ability, put soles on the boots we have ready for you here." 3 footstools were put before the boys, with needle, thread, boots, and soles on them. Aaron struggled to clamp the boot between his legs and to feed the thread through the needle, and soon realized he couldn't hammer well with his bruised hand. Clenching his teeth and ignoring the pain, he did as well as his talent and injury would allow. He took even longer than Holken, and his boots were no great shakes. Mistress Dolman examined the boot with a frown, and then shook her head. Holken's boot provoked the same reaction. Rufus's sample, on the other hand, showed even, clean stitching. Indeed, while the boy was working, he had been humming quietly to himself, moving the needle in a steady rhythm, and everyone could see clearly that the shy young boy must have been secretly practising for weeks. After a few seconds, the shoemaker gave a smile of surprise and said, with scarcely concealed joy, "Young Rufus may be moulded into the trade of shoemaker." Great, good for her and good for me, thought Aaron. If Holken's father steps forward and calls him to his side as apprentice, then I'll get the bailiff's job. Then I just have to pass the test, and there won't even be any competition. Full of expectation, he glanced over at the blacksmith, but he only looked over to his son and gave him an encouraging smile. Crucial seconds passed by with nothing happening, and a cold shiver ran down Aaron's spine as the realization suddenly struck him. Holken didn't want to become a blacksmith, but a bailiff. The terrible thought flashed through his head. Suddenly, the bailiff stepped forward and spoke. "He who wishes to protect this place and keep the peace must have the necessary skills in combat and be in the appropriate physical condition. As there are only 2 candidates left, they must take each other on with wooden sword and shield and put their abilities to the test." Gloomily, Aaron observed how Holken nonchalantly took up the sword and shield and held both of them easily, although the shield alone must have weighed at least 8 stone. Now Aaron received his weaponry. Awkwardly he strapped the shield to his injured left hand, and with his right he clumsily grasped the rough wooden sword handle. Holken's sword, held with a firm grip, pointed steadily towards the skies, while his own continually fell towards the earth. It took all his energy to raise it upwards. He was in a cold sweat already. He thought of all the tales where weak but nimble warriors defeated mighty but cumbersome monsters. Now, standing opposite the blacksmith's son, with the midday sun beating down and the whole village looking on, he didn't believe any of those stories any more. "Are you prepared?" asked Pragur. Holken thundered a powerful "Yes." Aaron, however, only managed a timid nod, which was greeted with a snigger from one of the village boys. Aaron glanced around once more, looked in the faces of the onlookers, and saw pity in almost all their eyes. They had already written him off. And then Aaron became angry. They had given up on him, just as his father had given up on him, just as he had almost given up on himself. He gripped his weapons more firmly, felt a painful stabbing in his left hand, and looked resolutely at Holken. His opponent was taken aback by his change of demeanour and gave him a respectful nod. "He who first drops his sword or surrenders, either through defeat or agreement, is the loser," called Pragur. "The victor shall be my new apprentice. And now, begin." The bailiff had hardly finished speaking when Holken sprang forward and swung his sword down on Aaron. He just managed to raise his wooden sword and parried the blow after a fashion towards the right. His right arm began to hurt with the force of the impact. The shield, Aaron thought, use your shield. The next blow was already coming towards him, because his left hand was already in pain from just holding the shield, and his right was still slightly numb. Aaron instinctively ducked, and Holken's blade whizzed over him. For his own part, and quite instinctively, Aaron swung his sword towards Holken, just as the latter was preparing to begin a powerful swing of his own. With a loud crash, Aaron's blunt sword landed on his opponent's shield. A murmur rose from the crowd. Nobody had thought that the delicate boy would last for more than a few seconds, never mind go on the attack. Even Holcomb seemed surprised and hesitated, giving Aaron the opportunity to hit him a couple more times. These blows were rather ineffective, however, as they were repeatedly repelled by the other's shield. Nevertheless, a feeling of triumph grew in Aaron, and he fired himself up by thinking, "I can do it. I can beat him. I'm going to be a bailiff. Holcomb brushed Aaron's last sword thrust to the side and rained down a series of punishing blows on the young boy's shield. Aaron could see stars in front of his eyes. Something went out of place in his hand, and suddenly the feeling of 1,000 hot needles exploded in his arm. But strangely, his hand now felt totally numb. When he looked down, he could see that his shield was hanging loosely from his arm, and his hand was dangling uselessly. The villagers around him were gasping. Another second passed, and despite the shock, the feeling in his hand gradually returned. Panting, he sunk down on one knee. Holcomb took a step backwards. "Do you yield?" he asked loudly. An eternity at my father's side echoed in Aaron's head, and he painfully stood up again. "Never!" Aaron gasped. The pain was getting worse. "I can stand so I can fight." The first cries to abandon the fight could be heard from the crowd, and Pragur was just moving into position, but Holcomb had heard Aaron's answer and shrugged his shoulders. He took 2 steps towards the injured youth and clipped him with his sword, a movement which Aaron wearily parried. But this was only a ploy, for at the same instant Holcomb smashed the edge of his own shield with full force down on the injured hand of the stunned youth. Aaron fell to the ground as if struck by lightning, while an overpowering darkness came over him and washed all sensation away. He was in the pond again, in the forest and under water which surrounded him and comforted him. It took away all his pain, all his feelings, leaving him comfortably numb. Time was unimportant in this wonderful, cool place. Then he noticed a movement in the pond. Something from below was coming towards him, something that was bigger than him. The spectre became clearer as it approached, inexorably. With horror he recognized the figure of his father, felt how he was being grasped and pulled into the depths. Aaron fought back, fought with all the strength he could muster, floundered and raged and kicked and somehow tore himself away. But the figure of his father grasped him firmly by his left wrist and pulled him into the depths again. A fiery pain began to rage under his skin, in his hand, where his father was grasping him. Aaron paddled and floundered, but his father's grip was too powerful, the saving light of the surface too far away. The more he pulled, the greater the pain. But Aaron did not want to give up, did not want to go into the darkness his father had prepared for him. Pragur's face loomed on the surface, and Aaron thrashed upwards with all his strength, fought his way up from the depths, his left arm in excruciating pain. Then he broke through the surface and opened his eyes. "He's awake again," said Pragur, and disappeared from Aaron's view. Aaron looked around him, totally disorientated. He was surrounded by faces: Holcomb, Dolman, Rufus, Pragur, and several more. Dust tickled his nose, and the sun stung his eyes. The one constant was the unbearable pain in his left arm. Aaron was afraid to look, to see what had become of his arm. Nightmarish pictures raced through his brain, of him as a cripple, fighting his way through life. Keeper Jigral's voice intoned, make room, I tell you, all of you." He carved out a passage through the crowd with untypical aggression, and knelt down beside Aaron. "You'll be all right, young man, you'll see," he said in a friendly voice, and took Aaron's mangled hand in his own. "This day is under the protection of him who moulds, and no one shall come to grief.
if it be not his will."
Closing his eyes, the gaunt man started to recite in a sing-song voice as he manipulated Aaron's injured hand and pushed the damaged bones back into their correct position. Aaron watched all this as through a veil. The priestly song seemed to vibrate in his head, and no pain seemed able to penetrate the movements. The young boy watched with grim fascination how Jigral, with eyes closed, put all the bones under his skin to rights, as if playing with one of those wooden puzzles where you always had to push the correct piece so that the next one would slot into place. The priest finished his song, and a profound silence hung over the village square, broken only by Aaron's heavy breathing. But that too began to ease off as the boy realized that the pain wasn't returning, although the keeper had finished. Slowly he tried to move his hand. To his amazement, it felt as if the injuries of the last 2 days had never occurred. While the boy was staring fixedly at his hand, Keeper Jigral stood up and spoke in a firm voice. "He who molds has determined the hand of this youth be healed. Let us pray." The whole village intoned the litany of the three, and Aaron had a little time to recover. Of course, he had heard of the healing powers of the keeper before, but he had never seen such a miracle healing, never mind experienced it on his own body. Following the death of his mother, his father had broken off all contact with the keeper. He was bitter that the priest had not been able to heal her. Jigral had tried to explain that the keepers could only put things into shape, mend broken bones or reattach limbs, for instance. The curing of diseases was beyond their competencies, however. An infected lung or a gangrene-infected leg was damaged in its substance, not in its form. But Edric didn't want to hear of it. And for this reason Aaron had only spoken to Keeper Jigral about 6 times in his life, each time more or less by chance and only briefly. There would be a beating if his father saw him with the charlatan, as he called him. Can charlatans cure limbs? He asked himself. His hand was answer enough. He knew why his father hadn't stopped the healing. A quick glance to the beer stand confirmed that Edric had fallen asleep long ago. The villagers had finished their prayer in the meantime, and Jigral began to speak again. "Now, Master Pragur, what say you?" The strong man with the steel-grey hair pushed himself forward and said, "Young Aaron and Holcon can be moulded to the position of bailiff." Aaron's heart jumped for joy. "As, however, I need only one apprentice, and as I determined the rules beforehand, I select Holcon," said the bailiff, and turning towards Aaron, he continued more quietly, "You're a brave boy with an impressive will to fight. I would have taken you on as an apprentice too, if I could have, but Deepstone is too small for so many bailiffs, and my apprentices would have to get on." With a last apologetic look to Aaron, he grasped the law enforcer Holcon by the arm and placed him by his side in the place of ritual beneath the bailiff's guild symbol. Aaron slumped down as Jigral began to utter his closing words, words that would seal his fate. "He who moulds has shown us today how the youths assembled here shall become members of our society." "Forgive the interruption, but we're not quite finished," a deep, full-bodied voice intoned from the edge of the square. Jigral looked angrily in the direction of the troublemaker, but could see nothing other than an unusual wooden shape that looked like a crooked sign. The construction started to move, and then Falk stepped from behind it and into the middle of the square. He wore the cloak he had made from Grey Fang, the fog cat. Aaron remembered the beast's reign of terror only as a succession of tedious days. He, like all the other village children, had not been allowed to leave the house until the forest guardian had killed the Dark One. He had only seen the guardian wear this cloak on one other occasion, when Tellum, a farm labourer, had been sent into exile for robbery. The guardian had worn the same clothing that time as he led the banished man's a day's march to the east and left him there. For weeks after, he didn't make an appearance in the village. There were rumours that Tellum had tried to win him over, and this had really bothered Fulk. Yet this somehow didn't fit into Aaron's picture of Fulk. The man was simply too stern. A frightening thought struck him. What if he wants to lead me into exile? Maybe the village council had judged our prank to be robbery, and as I was the only one to be caught, have I really made so many enemies? He looked around furtively while fear ran through his youthful veins, but he saw only curiosity in the faces of the others, with the exception, perhaps, of Jigral. His attitude veered between surprise and annoyance. "What does this mean?" he asked firmly. "Why are you disturbing this sacred ceremony?" "Disturbing? Surely not. I'm lengthening it, in fact." With that, Fulk spun the wooden construction around. It was clear that he had taken his spear, attached Aaron's practice shield, which looked quite the worse for wear, to it, and painted a bow and arrow onto the shield. Aaron saw it in a flash, the forest guardian's symbol. Fulk walked briskly until he was beside the bailiff, rammed the spear into the ground, and stood in front of it. "Master Fulk seeks a boy who can be moulded into a forest guardian," he said in a festive voice, before continuing in his normal grumpy tone. "Apologies for the delay, but I had to improvise a guild stake first." Jigral gathered himself together after this unexpected entrance, while a wild hope sparked within Aaron. The priest began to speak. "You didn't register your search beforehand. Technically, this may not be absolutely necessary. However, it's quite unusual. What has made you change your mind?" Fulk snorted. "You can't pick a forest guardian over one afternoon. I've said that many a time. We are the one line of defence if a dark one wanders our way." As he said this, he stroked his cloak, and the villagers shivered. With all due respect to the bailiffs who look after security within the village, Fulk shot Praga a look. Chasing a grief wind or a swarm claw alone in the wilderness is quite different from throwing a drunkard out of the tavern. The keeper interrupted him brusquely. "All well and good, but you still have not answered my question. So far you have only repeated the reasons you give every year to justify your refusal to take part in the ceremony." Jigral sounded annoyed, and Aaron hoped that Fulk wouldn't goad him any further, or his chance would be gone, and he'd have to work the fields with his father. "This year I have found a suitable candidate," Fulk continued calmly. "He has proven to me that he can climb, move swiftly through the wood, and that he is a very competent swimmer. He understands how to camouflage a shelter, and he has shown great stamina and tenacity here today. He has also exhibited valor in taking on a larger and stronger opponent, even while injured." He turned and looked directly at Aaron. "There is only one thing missing. The supreme forest guardian discipline is archery, and I thought this would be a fitting test for this ceremony." He bowed slightly towards the keeper. Jigral looked like the cat that got the cream. With a delighted look and a friendly voice, he said, "Well, that being the case, set the test." Fulk approached Aaron and gave him a hunting bow and a quiver with 3 arrows. Then he called out, "Archery is a difficult art, and so I will give the boy 3 chances to hit the target. It is the alarm bell sounded by a forest guardian if the village is in danger. Hopefully, after today, we will not hear it for a long time." With that he pointed to the large bell, positioned 3 paces high in front of the village hall. Only the bailiff, the forest guardian, and the town council could sound this bell. No others were allowed, on pain of severe punishment. A young boy had sounded it a few years previously as part of a prank. His punishment had been to sweep the village square at the first cock-crow in wind, hail, or snow. Everyone had steered clear of it since then. Even walking under it meant bad luck. All this went through Aaron's head as he took the bow in his left hand. He placed the arrow on the bowstring with his right. An eerie silence descended on the village square, but there was an almighty racket in Aaron's head, so great was his fear. His young spirit had gone through so much already today. He raised the bow awkwardly, as if in a trance. Trying to keep his trembling hand still, he aimed at the bell 20 paces away. As soon as the arrow left the bowstring, Aaron knew it wouldn't hit the target. The arrow bored into the ground 3 paces short of the village hall. A disappointed groan went up from the crowd. Aaron stood there in a cold sweat, and Falk looked thoughtfully at him. Then he turned towards the keeper. "The young boy is terrified and exhausted. May I have a word with him?" "Certainly," said Keeper Jigral, giving an understanding nod. Falk placed his hands on the young boy's shoulders and fixed his eyes on him. "I know you're afraid, you're tired, and to top it all, everyone is looking at you. But you must concentrate. You already shot with a bow. Don't you remember?" Falk asked quietly so no one else could hear. "Only during the autumn festival," Aaron answered shyly. The autumn festival took place once the harvest had been brought in and the village prepared for the winter. The adults and apprentices would dance while the children would take part in all sorts of games of skill, such as sack races, running competitions, climbing, apple bobbing, or wrestling. During the last 3 autumn festivals, Falk had set up a target range on the edge of the fair. He would let the children shoot with a short bow and practice arrows with cloth balls attached. Aaron had spent a lot of time there, far from the beer stand, where his father would make himself comfortable, and far from Holken and his gang. That was how he had first met Falk, but it seemed so terribly long ago now. The forest guardian shook him and whispered, "It's perfectly natural to be afraid. Everyone is afraid of something. When I encountered Grey Fang, I was afraid too." "You were afraid?" Aaron was stunned. "I'll show you a trick now. Where do you feel safest?" "Why?" asked the young boy, confused. "Trust me, and do as I tell you. You'll have to get used to obedience anyway as soon as this is behind you, so you may as well start now." Aaron tried to concentrate on the forest guardian's question. "Where do I feel safest?" He immediately thought of the tree-house. It was quiet and peaceful there at night, and his father couldn't find him there, as he knew nothing of its existence. "Safehold. The tree-house, I mean," responded Aaron. "Good. Now try and imagine how you feel when you're there, what it smells like there, what it feels like, what you hear and see whenever you're there, and how safe it is there." Aaron closed his eyes. His thoughts were whirling around. The hurtful words of his father, the danger of a future on the farm, his injured and now marvelously healed hand. All these thoughts swirled around his mind, and he found it impossible to concentrate. He tried thinking of the treehouse, looked at it with his inner eye, but the memory of Holken's raging face kept pushing through. No, it's safe there, thought Aaron. He clung to the thought, imagined how it felt when he was there at night. He thought of the late summer breeze wafting from the east, how soft it felt on his skin, felt it as it passed through the exposed walls. He heard the nightly concert of the forest creatures as they moved around in the dark, felt the silence that only a place empty of people brought forth. "Right," "Boy, now you have it," said Falk. "Now breathe in, hold your breath, draw the bow, and shoot." The crowd was silent and concentrated completely on the young boy, but he hardly noticed them. Aaron raised the bow, this time more calmly, though still clumsily, but now not shaking. He drew the bow. He shot. The arrow ricocheted with a dull clack off the door of the village hall, barely a pace from the bell. Aaron's veins ran cold with panic once again. Not even Falk himself could flout the ceremonial rules. Were Aaron to fail again, it would all be over. Falk would not be able to take him on as his apprentice. The images and fears were tormenting the young boy again. Falk carefully took the bow from his hand and asked him something, but Aaron was in such a state of panic, and there was such a roaring in his ears, he couldn't understand him. "The tree-house, think of the tree-house," he kept repeating to himself, as if it speaking to another person. Soon the image of Safehold, which had only now been smashed and scattered, formed itself again in his mind. With clenched fists he forced his fears away until they existed only on the outskirts of his consciousness. He could feel his legs shaking. Even if he were allowed to take a fourth shot, he sensed he only had reserves for this one last attempt. He was on the point of bursting into tears, and knew he wouldn't be able to calm down and hold it together for another attempt. Falk continued to speak quietly to him, and this time the words sank in. "You did everything correctly, in fact. The shot ought to have hit the target." Falk rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He was like somebody trying to solve a complicated puzzle. "Which hand do you use for buttering your bread, boy?" At first Aaron thought he'd misheard. The question was absurd, so pointless. His mind must be playing tricks on him. He was hearing things, but no. His mind was calm. The picture of the tree-house was still intact. Peace and quiet. A grasshopper chirping. "Which hand do I cut my bread with? My right, of course, my good hand." "Your good hand?" Falk's voice had an edge. "Have you always cut with that hand?" Aaron was confused again, and then he remembered something. Normally it would have embarrassed him, but he was way beyond embarrassment now. After all, this would be his last attempt. "No, when I was very small I always used the dull hand," and he raised his left hand. "But I haven't done that for years," he added quickly. He may have had to make this admission in front of everyone, but he could at least reassure Falk that he had been brought up properly. His father had driven out his tendency to use the dull hand through much scorn and endless beatings, as was only right. But Falk was angry and let out a curse. "I shouldn't have said that. Now he'll think badly of me and won't want me any more." This thought flashed through his mind. Quickly he concentrated on the inner peace that the picture of the tree-house brought about in him. But the picture was beginning to fray and wear away. He could already hear the sound of the other thoughts that wanted to carry him away. "Damn superstition!" cursed Falk, and grabbed Aaron by the shoulders. "Aaron, this is very important. Now listen to me very carefully. Hold the bow with your right hand, and place the arrow on it with your left." Falk was smiling now. "Trust me. Everything will be fine." Aaron was beyond all emotion now. Nothing made sense any more. Mechanically he took the bow that Falk handed to him with his right hand and placed the arrow on it with his left. It felt strange, but somehow more fluid. He gathered together all his strength once more and conjured up the tree-house in his head. He suppressed all other thoughts. A peaceful calm descended on his spirit. He inhaled and held his breath. Not even his breathing disturbed the inner silence. Everything seemed far away somehow, and unreal. He raised the bow, tautened it, aimed, and let the arrow fly. all within 2 heartbeats. Then he closed his eyes and breathed out. The ensuing silence was broken only by the clear sound of a solitary bell toll. Chapter 3. The ruptured eyes of the 2-headed calf fetus looked accusingly up at him as he withdrew his bloodied hands. His efforts were once again in vain. The unhappy animal had been stillborn 2 days previously, and now, to stop the stench, he raised a silk cloth to his nose. A servant scurried by, taking away the ritual bowl along with its gruesome contents. The magic had failed. The circumstances that had led to this bad omen no longer recognizable. The death of the poor creature too long ago. This was the 10th creature in as many months that had come into the world beyond the borderlands, and none of them could deliver him an answer. The dream mirror remained silent, and the elves too were baffled, no matter how much he pressed them. A bad feeling had been nagging him for years like a stone in a shoe. At first he had put it down to the increasingly fierce power games of the others, but now the cause seemed to have far darker roots. With a sigh he cleaned his blood-soaked hands in rose water, and took a piece of black chalk from one of his servants. He would cast a large magic net, and hope for the best. The events that followed were a blur for Aaron. The villagers congratulated him heartily before Keeper Jigral eventually managed to regain control of his ceremony. For the next hour Aaron's ears were ringing, and he found it impossible to concentrate on anything for more than 3 seconds. Every so often Falk would look at him and mumble something to himself. It took a good hour, with the priest's devotions coming to an end, for his head to clear a little. Falk noticed the change in the young boy's expression and whispered to him, "You'll feel better soon." Aaron could only nod. He was still too tired to answer, and what answer could he give? 1,000 questions whirled around his head, all important and pressing. But when he tried to concentrate on an individual one, it would vanish. There was nothing for it but to stand there and listen to the priest. "And so we call for the blessing of him who moulds, for the young men tested today. May they always find their place in our community. May they absorb the knowledge of their masters. May they mould it afresh in new forms of knowledge." With that, Keeper Jigral cupped his hands before his chest as a potter moulds his clay. It was the ritual greeting and farewell of the priests. The devotions ended, and the villagers burst into life once more. There was a lot of shouting and laughing. Many ran into the village hall to bring out tables, long benches, food and drinks. The part of the day the villagers had been looking forward to most was about to begin, the feast. The festive square was ready in no time at all. The villagers settled at their tables, in family groups, surrounded by friends. Aaron felt somewhat uneasy, as he always did on such occasions, and looked for Lycus's face in the crowd, hoping he would sit down near him. If his father found him beforehand, he would drag him to a place near the bar. He would then have to spend the rest of the evening sitting there quietly, ready to fetch his father a beer every time he had finished his tankard. Aaron was hopping from foot to foot, keeping an eye out for Lycus, when he heard Falk beside him. "Come with me and let's sit down." He marched determinedly through the crowd to a long table where Lycus's father was standing with other revellers. Taken by surprise, Aaron followed the forest guardian. He had forgotten completely that, as an apprentice, he could now sit with his master. Falk came to a halt, and immediately Aaron felt 2 wiry arms embracing him and heard Lycus's voice. "Wow, Aaron, what a surprise! You and the Guardian!" Aaron turned around to his friend and looked into his beaming face. He himself must have started smiling too, and to his surprise, he couldn't stop. "I'm going to be a forest guardian," thought Aaron. This thought was only now beginning to sink in. "It's going to take a long while to get used to it," he answered his friend. "I'm only glad I've escaped the farm." Lycus grimaced. "Where is your father, by the way? What has he to say about it?" Aaron shuddered. His father knew nothing of what had happened, but the fledgling apprentice didn't want to imagine how he would react. "He fell asleep during the trials. He probably knows nothing about it." "Well, being a forest guardian is an honourable profession. I'm sure he'll be delighted for you," answered Lycus comfortingly. Aaron wasn't so sure, but kept this thought to himself. He needed more time to come to terms with all the changes that were going to happen in his life. Yet he had no more time, for at that moment Lycus's father leaned over to congratulate him. "You really gave us a fright there, young man, in your fight with our newest bailiff. Congratulations on your new master. There are few people from whom you can learn more." Then he turned back to Falk and began conversing with him. The two boys exchanged surprised looks, for they had never known that the merchant held the forest guardian in such high esteem. Next, Lycus's mother pushed her way through the revellers and held Aaron firmly in her arms. "I knew everything would work out in the end. Rania would have been so proud of you." His late mother's name brought tears to his eyes. The thought that she'd be proud of him warmed a place in his heart, a place that had been cold for too long. "Thank you," he mumbled, and could say no more. He had pulled himself together somewhat when she released him from her embrace, but the warmth within remained and gave him strength. He sat down beside his master and suddenly realized how hungry he was. Everyone had already started eating, so Aaron didn't need to hold back, and took everything that he could lay hold on. Mature cheese of a golden yellow hue, sweetened bread with honey, boar stuffed with wild berries, and plenty of the dark sauce Lycus's mother made so skilfully, and that she always served when he stayed to dinner. "It seems expensive times lie ahead of you, Master Guardian," one of the villagers called out, looking at the enormous portion of food Aaron had piled on his plate. Falk looked at his apprentice with raised eyebrows. "Well, if we fail to bag the next dark one, I can always ask Aaron to eat it up, and if that doesn't work, then I'm stumped." While the table companions were laughing uproariously, Falk added quietly, "Your body is trying to compensate for all the energy you expended during the healing, the combat, and the void. Try not to eat too quickly, or you'll get sick and throw it all up. Your body needs strength, but your stomach must keep pace. So eat as much as you want, only slowly." Aaron didn't quite understand what Falk meant by void, but followed his advice. It wouldn't be a good idea to disregard his master's orders at the first time of asking. To the amusement of the others, and to the young boy's own surprise, he took 2 more helpings, and the portions were no smaller. Once Falk was convinced his protégé had adopted a slower eating pace for the day, he left him in peace with a satisfied, contented mumble. Lycus, on the other hand, jumped at the opportunity to tease his friend. "If you keep eating like that, you'll only amount to a bog-trotter," he said, grinning broadly. "Falk says it's because of the healing," said Aaron, with his mouth full. "That's true, now you say it. I was starving for a week after Keeper Jagral patched me up that time." Lycus had broken his leg 4 years previously during one of his climbing escapades. He had fallen 3 paces from a tree. Vera, the village healer, told Lycus's parents that his bone was shattered and he would probably be limping for the rest of his life. However, Keeper Jagral intervened and summoned the strength of the moulder. Aaron had heard horror stories from other villages where the priests would only undertake healing if they received donations, or sometimes wouldn't perform them at all, but this was shrugged off as only a rumour in Deepstone. The few disabled villagers were the unlucky ones who even Jigral's powers couldn't fully heal, and yet there was no ill feeling among them towards the priest, for he had indeed saved most of them from certain death. Like old Toll with his missing arm, he had been the one and only victim of the fog cat that Falk had killed. The monster had ripped the farmer's arm off and disappeared into the forest with it. Jigral had prayed for many hours and managed to close up the gaping wound, and thereby save the farmer's life. Ever since then old Toll never failed to assist the priest in his ceremonial duties. In fact, Aaron could think of only one person who showed animosity towards Jigral: his father. Aaron was brought right down to earth when he thought of Edric. He looked cautiously around for his father, but he was nowhere to be seen. He was probably sleeping off his drunkenness, or he had made himself at home at the beer barrel without his son. That was fine by Aaron. With a sigh of satisfaction, he pushed the empty plate away from him and looked around the table. Everyone was deep in conversation. Lycus's mother had taken on board her son's attentiveness towards Aaron, who was now feeling quite calm and at ease. The meal had strengthened his body, but his friends' friendly words, and those of his family, had strengthened his soul. He listened to the laughing and joking of the others with delight, saw the genuine closeness among the villagers, and watched the torches being put into position. He had lost all sense of time, and only when he looked up at the sky did he realize how much time had passed by. Darkness was slowly drawing in, and soon the torches would light up the festive square. The celebration normally went on late into the night, and this one would be no exception. On an impulse, Aaron spoke to Keeper Jigral as he was passing the table. The keeper wasn't averse to good food and the occasional tankard, but he was a stickler for observing his religious obligations. It was getting dark, and so he was returning to his chapel to hold evening prayers, as he did every day. It didn't seem to bother him that he sometimes held them without any attendees, and he always had a friendly word for the villagers. "Keeper Jigral?" Aaron asked the priest shyly. The priest stopped in surprise and paused. Then he spoke. "Aaron, my congratulations to you on your formation into Forest Guardian. What can I do for you?" Aaron blushed slightly. He wasn't used to addressing the priest. "I just want to thank you, Keeper Jigral. Without you, my hand would—" He couldn't say the words. He would never have become Falk's apprentice without a healthy hand, and would have remained a cripple by his father's side. The priest had saved far more than a boy's limb today. Jigral nodded patiently and came to Aaron's rescue as he struggled to find the right words. "It wasn't me that healed you. It was he that moulds. You must thank him. You could do this by attending prayers on God's days." Before Aaron could apologize, the keeper continued, "I know it wasn't your fault in the past, but perhaps I shall see you more often in future?" Aaron was still too embarrassed to answer and could only muster a nod. The keeper gave him an encouraging smile and continued on to the chapel. The young apprentice turned to the table again, and Falk, who had been involved in a lively discussion with the others, asked curiously, "What happened there?" "I just said thanks," he answered. The forest guardian's face softened for a moment, and he said, "That's good. I wouldn't be happy if I took an ungrateful apprentice under my wing. How did the priest answer?" "I should go to God's day prayers." "Well, that's only right. Remind me in good time." Lycus's father, Vellum, looked over at the two of them and said,
There's one other thing you two should do to finish the formalities.
Lycus's father drew his knife from his belt and passed it to Falk.
Sit down over there, he said,
and pointed Aaron to the seat opposite his master's. The boy changed his place obediently.
You seem to have recovered sufficiently, so now it's time to make the bond.
As the apprentice sat down, he asked,
The bond? I've never heard of that.
The conversations around the table had now come to a halt, and everyone was looking at the pair.
Lycus's father answered, It's an old custom that we rarely perform here in Deepstone. In days of yore, the pact between master and apprentice was sealed in this way. It was a promise never to leave the other in the lurch, even in the most difficult of times, and to make the training the strongest bond until it was deemed completed. In those days it was necessary in order to overcome feuds between families or class distinctions between master and apprentice. It's an important tradition and one worth retaining.
Falk looked at the knife in his hand and replied, But nowadays the position of the master is generally seen as untouchable, and he doesn't need to slash his apprentice as part of an old ritual. He looked at the merchant reproachfully, who, however, remained unimpressed, and replied instead, My master completed the bond with me, and I won't treat his memory with contempt by ignoring his teachings. Lycus and I will likewise complete the bond, even though we are father and son. You should heed my advice in this matter. Once Aaron had heard the word slash, he had stopped listening and could only now look at the knife in horror. Falk gave the merchant a searching look, rubbed his chin as he thought, and then said determinedly, Right then, let's do it. He turned to his frightened apprentice and sighed. Look at the young boy, we're frightening him to death. He shook his head and spoke reassuringly to Aaron. You have no need to fear. Look. And with a quick cut, Falk scratched his palm until a little blood appeared. And now you put your arm out. Aaron obeyed reluctantly. You must trust your master, said Falk. Then the fledgling apprentice felt a slight pain as the blade cut his skin. Now put it there, said Falk, and stretched out his hand. Aaron gave his master his hand, who gripped it firmly, and then said, Now we are master and apprentice. Now you are master and apprentice, intoned Master Vellum. Turning to Falk, he muttered, Even if you think this form of ritual is outdated, it's important to do it properly. He turned to the surrounding tables, all of whom were looking at this point, stood up and called loudly, I, as a neutral master, witness the bond between Master Falk and apprentice Aaron. Do any other masters bear witness? Many of the assembled seemed baffled at first. This form of ritual was indeed older than Vellum had indicated. After a few moments, however, 6 mistresses and masters had raised their hands. Vellum sat down again contentedly, and turned to the 2 forest guardians. Falk looked Lycus's father in the eyes and nodded once. Whatever was going on between the 2 of them, Aaron couldn't figure it out. All he knew was if Falk didn't loosen his grip soon, he would definitely lose his right hand. At this point it had stopped tingling. Falk finally released his grip and fished 2 clean towels from his cloak. Here, press that on the cut. It will stop bleeding in a few minutes. Lycus got involved now. You say it was a spontaneous decision to seek an apprentice, yet you still brought suitable bandages for the bonding with you. We see through you, good Master Forest Guardian. He beamed at everyone, and many nodded in agreement. Admit it, you planned it all along. Lycus, as a forest guardian, you always need to have bandages with you. You never know when you need them, Falk responded, unmoved. The others laughed and clapped Falk on the back, and Lycus and Aaron exchanged looks. Am I glad I'm becoming a merchant? the wiry boy whispered to his friend. Aaron looked at his bloody hand and the bandage, and at this moment could only agree. 2 hours later, and Aaron had really joined in the merriment at the table. There was much laughter. Falk had passed around a bottle of wine, and Aaron was allowed to drink too. After all, he was now an apprentice, and several songs had been sung. Aaron had only been an observer at these feasts until now. He had never been a part of them. This feeling of security was remarkably pleasant, and he felt a warm glow inside. Suddenly he felt a calloused hand on his shoulder, and an overpowering smell of beer and stale sweat filled his nostrils.
"So this is where you've been hiding yourself."
His father's speech was slurred.
"Come on, we're going."
The grip on Aaron's shoulder became even more painful, as was always the case when Edric's movements had been numbed by alcohol. This hand seemed to be sucking out all the warmth and affection, and the sense of belonging Aaron had experienced over the last few hours. He hardly had time to react when his father turned around and started to leave, without loosening the grip. Before the boy had pulled his second leg back from the table, he lost his balance and fell to the ground. His father lost his balance too and crashed against one of the tables. Cursing and swaying, he planted himself over Aaron when he heard Falk's voice.
"That's my apprentice you've thrown to the ground. You'll do well to help him up."
The drunkard squinted owlishly as he prepared his words.
"Apprentice? Him?"
Edric laughed disdainfully.
"That's my son, and I'm taking him with me now."
With an almighty yank, he pulled Aaron to his feet by the hair. Aaron gave a pleading look to everyone around him, and saw Vellum whispering something to the forest guardian, at which point Falk slowly rose and said in a quiet voice, "You will leave my apprentice alone, or I will defend him according to the old law." His arms tensed up, and Aaron saw muscles like cables bulging under his leathery skin. The older man's posture had completely changed, and his whole appearance radiated enormous danger, like a predator sizing up its prey. The question didn't seem to be if he would attack his opponent, but when. A fire blazed in the eyes of the forest guardian such as Aaron had never seen before, and judging by the shocked looks of the other villagers, he was not the only one. Only Master Vellum gave Falk a satisfied look. Aaron's father, meanwhile, strengthened his grip. He was too drunk to notice the danger he was in, and began hauling his son away from the light of the torches into the darkness.
"I'm this boy's father, and I decide what's to be done with him until he comes of age. The village will never allow the father's rights to be questioned."
In the meantime, the bailiff had stood up with his apprentice and quickly approached them. With a slick hand movement, born of years of experience dealing with tavern brawls, Master Prager freed the young boy from the drunkard's grip and gestured to Holken to step between the adversaries. Falk calmed down visibly once Aaron was free and resumed his normal, relaxed attitude. Aaron was just as surprised by this transformation as he had been by the first. His master turned, and with a quiet voice addressed the bailiff.
"I hereby declare a feud with Edric the farm worker. As his son is my apprentice, I will take him according to the rights of my bond until his apprenticeship is complete or the feud ended."
Prager stroked his moustache and stared at Falk with narrowed eyes.
"The bonding? Yes, I saw the ritual earlier, as did half the village. So it looks like I can't do anything about it."
He gave Aaron a quick smile before turning to his father.
"The master will take the young boy with him, as is the custom, and you, my friend, will sleep off your drunkenness and let the good people here carry on with their festivities."
Praga and Holken grabbed Edric and brought him, despite his loud, drunken protestations, to the bailiff's barrack room. It had a room where troublemakers could sleep off their intoxication. It wouldn't be the first night Aaron's father had spent there. "That young boy is going to be a first-rate bailiff," mumbled Fulk as he watched Holken go off. "Did everything correctly and reacted well, even if he doesn't particularly like you. You'll really have to match up to that, after all the trouble you've caused." The twinkle in his eyes softened the blow of what he had said, and he laid an arm on Aaron's shoulders. "We'd better bring you home. That's enough excitement for one day." The villagers had begun having quiet conversations among themselves again, and occasionally looked over at the master and his apprentice. Most of them gave Aaron smiles of encouragement. Fulk went to the table with the young boy to pick up the rest of his belongings. Master Velen, with his arms clasped in front of his chest, looked up at the forest guardian and grinned broadly. He nodded to the merchant once and said, "I should listen to your advice more often. That was a clever way out you gave me. That wouldn't have worked without the bonding, and Aaron's father would have been in the right." "Thank you." Lycus looked up at his father in awe, who shrugged his shoulders and said, "It stood to reason that Edric wouldn't let his son go. I was only too happy to help. For years I've had to listen to how that awful man treats his own son. Sometimes it only takes a few well-placed words to emerge the winner in a particular situation. Look on it as your first lesson, Lycus." At that point Vellum began to explain to his son and apprentice the finer points of trade negotiations. Fulk nodded goodbye to the revellers and led the exhausted boy to his new home. Chapter 4. The sun was already a hand's span over the horizon when Aaron woke up. There was no sign of Fulk, and so the young boy looked around the hut, which would be his home from now on. He had been worn out the night before, and the forest guardian had led him to a corner of the room with a mattress and a blanket. The boy had fallen asleep straight away. He could see by the light of day that the hut was quite big enough for one person. It was completely finished in wood. At first glance there didn't appear to be any joints in the wood, but when Aaron went closer to the wall and looked more closely, he saw that each beam was cut perfectly into the next. He had never seen such accurate craftsmanship. The furnishings in the hut, on the other hand, were very plain. A simple stool adorned a round table. There was a shelf on the wall with a few wooden bowls and cooking utensils. The massive chest in the corner of the room was padlocked, so it probably contained all the forest guardian's worldly belongings. The cooking area consisted of a pot on a tripod, over which a hole in the ceiling was visible. No fireplace, no oven. Aaron pulled the blanket back and stood up. The bed on which he had spent the night seemed to be made out of some kind of fibrous material which he didn't recognize. The mattress was only 2 fingers thick, and yet the young boy had slept better on it than on the usual straw mattress, 2 handspans thick. He was still puzzling over the material and design of the mattress when the room darkened. He turned his head and saw Fulk standing in the door. "Good morning, Aaron. Good that you're awake. I wouldn't have let you sleep much longer."
"Good morning, Master Fulk," Aaron caught himself.
"We actually get up much earlier, but because you had to go through rather a lot yesterday, I've decided on a more leisurely start to the day, so I went to get a few things. As you can see, I'm not set up for guests, never mind an apprentice."
Aaron was taken aback and had another look around. There really were no more mattresses. "Where did you sleep?" Fulk pointed with his thumb over his shoulder.
"Outside, if it's warm and dry enough, I feel better in the open air."
Aaron glanced through the window in the direction indicated,
5 paces from the house there was a broad fir tree, and at its feet there was a blanket. His master didn't seem to place much value on comfort. "First we eat," Falk decided, and brought over a newly constructed stool which he placed opposite the other one. Then he took a bundle wrapped in an oilcloth from his back and slowly laid it on the ground. "I can imagine you have a few questions. If you have too many questions in your head, there comes a point when you can't hear the answers any more." With practised movements, Falk quickly lit a small fire under the pot. "Unpack your things while the stew is warming." Falk stirred the spoon in the pot with one hand and pointed with other at the bundle he had put down on the floor. Aaron went over to it with curiosity and opened out the oilcloth. He gasped in surprise. He saw a pair of boots, a jerkin, and leggings, all made from buckskin. There was also a hunting knife in a buckskin scabbard. Wide-eyed, he stared at the treasures in front of him. The boots alone looked better made than anything he had ever worn. His father had never brought much money home and had drunk most of it, leaving Aaron very often dependent on the charity of the other villagers. And so he often wore the cast-offs of the other village boys, and these were continually patched up until he had grown out of them. He had never seen clothes like those lying in front of him. He looked up at his master with gratitude, but he had turned his back and was fully occupied with the stew. "You're lucky that I placed an order for a new set of clothes with Mistress Dolman. I collected them earlier. The woman is up almost as early as I am. Her new apprentice, Rufus, doesn't seem too happy about that." Falk laughed heartily before continuing, "What you're wearing at the moment would have been in tatters by the afternoon. Not that they'd be much loss, but you'd have lost half your skin as well." He could have given me his old clothing and held on to the new for himself, thought Aaron. "Thank you," he said, "but I'm afraid I'll have to remain in your debt." He wanted to keep things clear between them before he even touched the clothing. The forest guardian turned around and looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Don't worry about that. You'll be earning those clothes. I meant what I said on the village square yesterday. You have what it takes to become a forest guardian. I don't take on apprentices lightly. In fact, you're the first. It will be a learning experience for the two of us," said the forest guardian, with a twinkle in his eyes, and turned again towards the fire. "You should put on the things and see if they fit. Mr. Stolman did make a few alterations early this morning. That woman really has a good eye, but we want to be sure, don't we? What's important is that you can move well in them, but that they're not too big. Oh, and behind the house is a stream if you want to wash yourself first." Aaron nodded and disappeared behind the hut with his things. A small stream, perhaps 2 paces in width, gurgled along behind the house. The current was gentle, and Aaron stomped, snorting into the water until it reached his hips. The clear, cold water banished all tiredness from his bones, and after he had dried himself with his old clothing, he slipped into his new. The leather was supple and had already been oiled, and everything fitted well, apart from the shoulders and the leggings. The boots were a little big, but Aaron had experience of making clothes fit. He stuffed the front of the boots with strips of cloth he had cut from his old shirt. He rolled up the leggings and cushioned the shoulders. Within a few minutes he was finished and went back into the house. Falk was already waiting for him with 2 steaming bowls of stew. The forest guardian offered him a bowl and eyed him critically. "It'll do for now. You'll have grown into them soon. Now, eat and ask what you have to ask." Aaron took a spoonful of the stew, which consisted of rabbit, vegetables, and several herbs he couldn't identify. In an effort to win time, he tasted the food, chewed it slowly while he tried to think of what he wanted to know first. The food tasted amazing, and Aaron noticed that the same hunger came over him that he had felt the previous day at the feast. His body still needed to compensate for the healing process of the previous night. In order to eat his food in peace, he threw the first question he could think of into the room.
Why did you decide to take part in the Apprentice search in the end? Why are you going to so much trouble on my account?"
"As I already said, you have what it takes to be a forest guardian. There's a girl in 2 Rocks who would also be suitable, but her apprenticeship trial isn't until next year. I saw how you fought your way through the tests. You did your best without complaint or excuses, in spite of your injury, and you didn't give up. But it was something else that tipped the balance."
Aaron froze, his spoon halfway towards his mouth. "And what was that?"
Fulk studied the boy for a moment before he spoke. "Bad people are not born that way. They are created, by us, by all of us. What we experience shapes us, and in a permanent way. Throw enough weeds into a well and it becomes poisoned. Clean it regularly and fish out the weeds, you always have clear water. Sven, the miller's son, he was always a timid boy, but that doesn't make him into a bad person. But if his parents don't take the fear away from him but stoke it up so that they can keep him under control, then he'll continue to hide behind every strong back he can find and use every bit of power he can lay hands on."
Aaron shuddered as he remembered the look Sven had given him at the treehouse. Could fear really create so much anger?
"I've seen and heard how your father treated you, and so far you've put up a great fight in order not to be influenced by it, or at least not much. But the thought of what would happen to you if no one intervened was unbearable. Sometimes we create the biggest monsters by doing nothing."
Aaron was both confused and annoyed. The thought that Fulk could see a future monster in him was far from flattering. His reaction could be seen in his face because Fulk continued,
"That wasn't what you wanted to hear, was it? But it's important that you understand it. If I hadn't intervened, you'd probably become a bitter, sad man. Unfortunately, bitter, sad men have the habit of spreading more sadness and bitterness, and some of these people are particularly successful. I know what I'm talking about."
Fulk gazed into the distance as he spoke. There was a sadness in his face before his features softened, and he turned to Aaron again.
"Our work as forest guardians will repeatedly lead to confrontations with the Dark Ones. How will you fight a grief wind if you haven't learned to subdue your bad experiences?"
Fulk didn't wait for an answer, but continued,
"You're a good person, and you can become a good guardian. If I hadn't stepped in, you'd be at the very least a sad person, and certainly no forest guardian. Wasn't that a good enough reason?"
Aaron nodded shyly. He was grateful to his master, but the thought that he had been selected in order to prevent a greater evil remained. Fulk could see that his apprentice was not completely persuaded, but decided not to press further. The young boy had little reason to trust people, and his little speech had undermined the boy's self-confidence even more. He decided to change the subject.
"Have you ever actually held a real bow in your hand? I don't mean that old thing with the practice arrows from the Harvest Festival. Your last shot yesterday was really very good. The bow tautened, raised, aimed, and released in a single flowing movement. I had a look at the bell this morning. It wasn't just a glancing shot, it was a bullseye."
The Guardian's words had their effect. Aaron's face lit up, and youthful vivacity came flooding back into him. Of course, the fact that he'd just finished his 4th bowl of stew might have helped, too. "No, I've never shot with a real bow and arrow, but it was all so easy somehow once it was calm in my head and I'd swapped hands."
And he looked down at his right hand, which held the soup spoon. "We'll have to work on that, boy. There's nothing wrong with using the left hand. That's just superstition. Does your father come from the low marshes?"
Aaron nodded, carefully took the spoon in his left hand, and answered, deep in thought, He grew up at the edge of the borderlands. He wanted to get away from there like so many others and move further into the Midlands. And there is no more peaceful kingdom in the Midlands than Hrjalgar, so this is where he settled.
Yes, the people there have strange ideas. Their proximity to the pole pillar has made them too cautious and superstitious, if you ask me.
Falk pointed at Aaron's hand, which was holding the spoon rather clumsily.
It'll take you a while to get used to it. Then everything will be much easier, believe me.
Aaron looked up with curiosity. And what was that? The void, I think you called it yesterday.
The Guardian nodded. Yes, the void. That's the trick I showed you. That's where you concentrate on emptying your mind. I'm surprised it works so well. On the other hand, I've heard that some people in extreme situations were able to do it in no time at all, but don't expect it to work so quickly the next time.
Oh, said Aaron, disappointed.
I'm not saying you won't be able to learn it, but it takes time. Anyway, I had to improvise yesterday. The tree house probably won't last as a focus point for too much longer unless you're more attached to it than I thought.
He smiled at the youngster. A focus point? What do you mean?
The picture you concentrate on when you're trying to reach the void, but we'll deal with that later. Do you have any other questions?
Aaron looked down at the knife that was sheathed in his scabbard in front of his chest. Before he could ask his question, Falk said quickly,
Oh no, that will stay where it is for the moment. The knife is only to be used in absolute emergencies, unless I say otherwise. In our line of work, you've made a terrible mistake if you get so close to an animal that you must use it to defend yourself. Firstly, you have to get to know the forest and really take in everything that I teach you about it, and we can train your left hand at the same time. Then we'll see how it's going.
Falk stood up and opened the lock of the chest, using a small key which hung on a leather strap around his neck.
Why don't you make yourself useful and do the washing up while I assemble the things we need for the day?
Aaron stood up obediently and carried the bowls out to the stream. When he returned to the hut a few minutes later, Falk had a bow in his hand and a big rucksack on his back.
Today I'll carry everything while you try to keep pace. Let's go.
As he spoke, Falk walked quickly towards the forest, and Aaron hurried alongside him. The first day was promising to be really easy. He'd been in the forest so often before and would have no problems keeping up with a heavily laden older man. An hour later, and Aaron was flat on his back again, gasping for air. Falk was squatting beside him with an amused look. It had taken only a few minutes after the start of their march for the penny to drop with Aaron. Falk was going to keep up the fast pace he was using. That in itself wouldn't have been a problem, yet neither the trees nor the uneven ground, nor the undergrowth, nor even the little streams would slow Falk down. The same couldn't be said for his young companion. He had never been clumsy in the forest before, but the speedy pace ensured that he couldn't avoid the branches in time, and he also stumbled over roots and got caught up in the brambles. Now he understood what Falk had said earlier when he had spoken about Aaron's old clothes and how they would be in tatters. The buckskin protected him from thorns and the whipping branches. His old clothes would have been torn and useless within minutes, and as for his skin, Aaron shuddered to think what state it would have been in by now. He stumbled behind Falk, keeping pace after a fashion, gasping for air and cursing to himself whenever he managed to get enough air into his lungs. As soon as the Guardian stopped, Aaron collapsed on the spot. It was a mystery to him that Falk hadn't sent him back to the village there and then.
That will do for the moment. Once you've got yourself together, we can have a look at the plants that are growing here.
Aaron nodded gratefully and listened intently as Falk showed him the various plants in the clearing.
After a quarter of an hour he said, "Right then, up you get. We've a long way ahead of us." Groaning, Aaron struggled to his feet and followed his master into the forest. And so the day went on in this fashion. An hour's march, then a quarter-hour break, during which time he learned to recognize the different plants. Falk always seemed to seek out the places where very many different varieties of plants could be found. By the time they were returning to the cabin in the late evening, Aaron could hardly place one foot in front of the other. Falk took off his rucksack and said, "So, my boy, let's see what you've remembered." He produced many bundles of green plants and laid them out on the grass. "Tell me which ones you recognize and what they're called." Aaron could hardly believe his ears. His legs were no longer his own, and he had an overpowering desire to curl up into a ball and fall asleep. As he looked at the plants lying in front of him, he realized he couldn't identify a single one. Falk was silent and let the boy think. Aaron considered them for a long time, as he really wanted to name at least one of them. His eyes wandered again and again over the various branches, grasses, berries, and mushrooms. Finally, his eyes settled on a reddish plant. He pointed at it and said uncertainly, "Wolf herb?" Even to his own ears it sounded more like a question than a statement. "Do you know another one?" asked Falk. The young boy shook his head. His ears were red. "First I spend the day trudging and panting my way through the wood, as if I had never been in the open air before, and now I can only identify one measly plant," thought Aaron forlornly. He was downcast. Of course Falk would send him back, would explain that he'd made a mistake, that Aaron would never evolve into a good forest guardian. But his master merely nodded, gathered everything up, and placed it into the chest. "That was very good. It took me 3 days before I could even recognize one. My master was at his wits' end." The young boy looked up in amazement. It seemed absurd to him that his master could ever have struggled with the same problems. Surely Falk was only softening the blow. His disbelief must have been written all over his face, because once Falk had stored all the plants, he looked up and chuckled. "It's only natural that you don't believe me. You should just keep in mind that I've had a much longer time to practice than you have. One plant is a good result for your first day." Falk fell silent, and Aaron thought that his master must be finished. But then he continued and fixed Aaron with a steely look and spoke with an intense urgency. "You must think in small steps, one plant after the other, one step after the other. There are so many things to learn, so many things you don't know about yet, things that are second nature to me now. I'm sure it seems like an impossible task to you, but there's only one rule that's essential for your training: never give up. You can make mistakes, you can learn incredibly slowly or be clumsy as you like, but you cannot give up. If you don't, you'll learn everything from me that I know, and in all honesty, that's not quite a lot." The grin reappeared on Falk's face, and he slapped his apprentice on the shoulder. The young boy could only stare at his master in silence as he thought about everything he had heard. Never give up. His master had reduced all his fears, doubts, into this simple rule, and this had an incredibly soothing effect on Aaron, because a promise resonated through Falk's words, one which deeply moved the youngster. As long as he didn't give up, then Falk would not give up on him either. After they had polished off the rest of the stew from the morning, the youngster lay down on the mattress and fell asleep immediately. His quiet, deep breathing filled the hut, and Falk noticed that his apprentice was smiling in his sleep. The old man couldn't possibly know this, but it was the first time in years that Aaron was at peace in his sleep. Chapter 5. Whatever about Aaron smiling in his sleep, the next morning was hell. He was woken up by his master's low humming as he warmed up a herbal soup. The delicious aromas permeated the little cabin, and the boy's stomach started to rumble. He moved to get up, groaned hoarsely, and clenched his legs. The least movement, and he felt as if he were being pricked with needles. Falk turned around when he heard the groans of this apprentice. "Good morning, Aaron," he said with a chuckle. "Are you hungry?" "The soup smells good, master, but it would taste even better if you had a new pair of legs for me." Aaron sat up clumsily and pulled his legs slowly under him so that he could stand. It took all his willpower not to groan again, but he gave a clenched smile to his mentor. Falk nodded knowingly. "That's good. You're fighting your way through. Don't give up. Come here, the soup will help you. Some of the herbs will ease the pain, and others will help your muscles to get through the day." The boy walked unsteadily to his stool and looked at his companion in horror. "We're running again today?" "No, we're not," said Falk with an impassive look. "Great." A wave of relief came over Aaron, and he flopped down on the stool. "We'll go at the same pace today as we did yesterday. I think that we'll wait with the running for a bit." The old man's demeanour remained the same, but Aaron truly believed that his master was enjoying every second of this. Resigned to his fate, Aaron grasped his spoon and tried the food. The soup was strong and thick, the taste was intense and spicy, and Aaron had swallowed 3 bowl-fills within minutes. As he reached for the bowl again, Falk shook his head. "That's not a good idea, boy. Any more and you'll get sick as soon as we leave the house. Your body needs to regain the energy you lost through the healing, but it has to be done slowly. Why don't you wash yourself and get dressed while I prepare everything for today's march?" Aaron recognized an order, even if it was formulated politely, and stood up obediently. To his surprise, he realized that the stiffness in his legs and the pains had become distinctly more bearable. Whatever was in the soup had had an immediate effect. He clamped his leather clothing under his arm and left the hut while his master began tidying up. When he came back a few minutes later, Falk was already dressed and was equipped with the same rucksack as the previous day, although it looked distinctly heavier today. "Ready, then let's go." Falk tossed something to Aaron, which bounced off the surprised boy's chest and rolled across the floor. He bent down to pick it up and saw that it was a leather ball, not quite the size of a fist. He looked over questioningly at the guardian, who gestured to him to throw the ball back. "With your left," he said firmly. Aaron threw the ball somewhat clumsily to his master, who then left the hut and strode quickly into the undergrowth. His apprentice followed him into the warm summer's day with a sigh and resigned himself to his fate. He trotted a while to catch up with Falk, when suddenly the ball flew at him from the greenery. He just managed to pull his hand up, otherwise the thing would have hit him in the face. As it was, it just bounced painfully off his hand, his right one. Falk's voice echoed through the forest. "With the left, boy, and don't just stand there. The way is long today, and I'd like the ball again." Aaron rubbed his hand with a curse, picked up the ball, and ran wearily into the forest. The hours passed as they had done the previous day, except that Falk would throw him the ball again and again, and Aaron would have to catch it with his left hand and throw it back again. This meant that the apprentice not only had to keep up the pace, avoid the branches, and look out for the roots, but also keep sight of Falk, as he never knew where the cursed ball would fly from next. Aaron was spurred on by the realization that the leather ball really hurt when it hit his face, which happened regularly at the start. Any time he dropped the ball, he would have to follow it, and then catch up with his master, who didn't wait, of course. Aaron never thought he would hate anything so much in such a short time as this small piece of sewn leather. It was almost noon. Falk had just placed the plants in front of him, which he brought with him in the rucksack, instead of plucking them again. He looked at the position of the sun in the sky and said, "Now we should be there soon, so be on your best behaviour." "Be where soon?" asked Aaron in surprise. "At Vera's, of course. Don't you know where we are?" Falk sounded genuinely surprised. Aaron looked around and recognized that they were in an offshoot of the forest that was known by the villagers simply as Herbal Grove. Vera, the village healer, lived here, and Deepstone itself was only a few hundred paces away. They must have been running in a wide curve. Aaron hadn't been paying any attention to his surroundings on account of his exhaustion and perpetual concentration. "But what do we have to do at hers, master? Are you ill?" "Don't be silly. Who do you think she gets her herbs from if they grow in inaccessible places and can't be raised in her garden?" Now that his master had mentioned it, he remembered hearing that Vera had been helped by the guardian. The woman was over 80 summers old and couldn't walk so well any more. But there wasn't a family in the village she hadn't assisted, healing an ill family member or saving domestic livestock. For this reason she always had a steady stream of visitors who supplied her with everything she needed. She also loved chatting and listening, which made her the best port of call, along with the tavern and the village well, if you wanted to hear the latest news, which only increased the willingness of the villagers to give her a helping hand. Falk looked at the boy sternly. "This will be your first appearance as my apprentice. Be polite, speak as little as possible, and don't get in the way." "Yes, master," Aaron stammered. He knew Vera. The old woman was always friendly to him, and Falk's harsh instructions seemed over the top. "Unless he's ashamed of me," he thought quickly. Falk seemed to realize what Aaron was thinking, and he said in a milder tone, "The healer's house is a hotbed of rumors. I don't want you to say anything that could be taken the wrong way. The beginning of your training was dramatic enough, and the bonding ritual I performed with you was unusual too. We don't want to add grist to the mill." And with that the guardian threw the leather ball at Aaron, who had been staring at his master, but instinctively raised his left hand and plucked the ball out of the air. He tossed the ball back to his master in triumph. "That's a start," said Falk, and nodded. They went a little further and came to a small clearing that lay directly at the forest's edge. Only a few trees separated the small thatched log cabin with its large, tidily cultivated herb garden from the first houses of the village. A well-worn, narrow brick path snaked its way between them. Everything was neat and tidy. The herb garden was surrounded by a thick wooden fence, and there was even a luxurious flower bed just before the front door, wafting beautiful smells in the late afternoon sun. Aaron had only been here twice before, and that was in autumn and winter. It looked so different now, and took him a few seconds to recognize the place. Falk gave him another stern look as they reached the front door. They could hear voices from the inside, conversing cheerfully. Obviously the latest morsels of gossip were being exchanged, and Aaron understood now why his master had insisted on a note of caution. Falk knocked on the door. The voices fell silent within, and they entered the house. A friendly woman with a smile on her deeply wrinkled face was sitting in her rocking-chair. Although it was warm, her legs were wrapped in a woolen blanket. A young woman had just risen from the stool and was picking up a basket. It was Senja. Her mother was the village weaver, and she was the eldest daughter.
"I'd better be going now. I've wasted too much time already," she said.
She nodded to the herbalist, smiled uncertainly towards Falk and Aaron, and darted out before hurrying away quickly. The boy looked after her thoughtfully. Was he mistaken, or had she been afraid of them? "Now, don't be brooding," said the old woman instead of a greeting, and smiled at Aaron. She seemed to see right into him with her clever eyes. "You two, with your leather gear and your knives, are well capable of giving a right fright to a pretty young thing." Falk snorted and bent down to give Vera a kiss on the cheek. "The boy worries too much about what other people think of him, but I'll drive that out of him." She smiled up at him and patted him on the cheek. "Don't be too hard on him, or he'll run away from you yet." Aaron was totally taken aback by his master's friendly, even affectionate behavior. "That would be pointless," said Falk. "I'm a forest guardian. I'll find him anywhere." "At least that sounds like the Falk I know," thought Aaron. He positioned himself in a corner of the room and tried to be as unobtrusive as possible, while looking around with curiosity. The house was one-roomed, just like the guardian's lodgings, and the beams in the roof were festooned with bundles of herbs. They were hanging from them at different stages of the drying process. There were shelves on 2 walls with pots, jugs, and little jars, all labelled in tiny handwriting. A cooking area and a narrow bed filled the other walls. A table with 2 stools, as well as the large rocking-chair Vera was sitting on, stood in the middle of the room. Falk began to empty his rucksack and to spread out the herbs he'd gathered the previous day on the table. Vera looked at him as he worked with a contented smile on her lips. "They'll do for a while. You've brought an unusually large amount of plants today, even some I have here in the garden, although I have only a few of each sort." Falk pointed with his thumb towards Aaron. "Basic training." Vera nodded. "Typical Falk. Why give one task when you can do 2 or 3 at the same time?" The healer waved Aaron towards her and pointed at the plants on the table. "And? Do you recognize any of them yet?" As Aaron approached the table, he felt Falk's penetrating look and immediately began to sweat. He took up the red plant that he had identified the previous day and said, "Wolf herb." "Good. Keep going." The old woman's gentle eyes seemed to radiate total confidence in his abilities, so that he felt unable to explain that he'd only heard of medicinal plants the day before. Instead, he looked down at the table and tried to remember. Low herb and blue head, and this one had to be sharp thistle. Aaron was pointing at the individual herbs, which had individual characteristics or striking colours. He had tried to concentrate on the plants that had stood out during the break earlier in the day, and this was now helping him. But there were another 30 bundles in various shades of green on the table that said nothing to him. His 2 older companions looked at him fixedly, Vera patiently, and Falk sternly. A gust of wind carried the sumptuous aromas from the flower bed at the front door into the house, and this gave Aaron an idea. He bent down over the table, and immediately 2 intensive scents filled his nostrils. Stinkweed and sneeze root. He had identified 2 further plants. Falk snorted contentedly, and Vera gave a smile of encouragement. "You've found yourself a clever apprentice, you old fox," she chuckled. Aaron beamed with pride and looked up at his master, only to be surprised by the leather ball which hit his nose. He shot his left hand up far too late, and only managed to give himself a blow under the chin. "A start," said Falk dryly, while his apprentice angrily chased the leather ball and cursed silently to himself, using every bad word he had ever learnt. When he stood up again and turned around, he saw the old woman had a very serious look on her face. "Be careful out there, and take care of the boy. One of the woodcutters saw a deer last week that had literally been torn to shreds, as if by a blood wolf." Aaron held his breath. Had he heard correctly? Falk snorted. "You know what the woodcutters are like, superstitious to the last. They're always seeing things that aren't there." "It won't do any harm to take a little care, though," Vera added. Falk responded in a calm voice. "Blood wolves rarely come so far to the east. The last one I saw was over 20 years ago, and anyway, they're unbelievably territorial. If there were one here, then there would be dead wolves and bears lying all over the forest." Aaron gave a strangled gasp, and Falk turned to look at his apprentice. The boy had gone pale with fright and was staring wide-eyed at Falk. "Look what you've started with your idle chatter. The boy is totally shocked," grumbled Falk. He went up to the terrified boy and put a hand on his shoulder. Aaron looked up at him and stammered, "Can a blood wolf really kill a bear?" Falk led him to the table where the old woman was sitting, and, looking at the boy keenly, he gently pushed him down onto one of the stools and sat beside him. "This was really only supposed to be discussed much later on in your training, but as the subject has now been broached, we might as well get it over with." Falk shot the herbalist an angry look, but she looked back at him serenely. "What do you know about the Dark Ones?" Falk asked in a quiet voice. Aaron's mind was racing. His head was full of the old stories that were told around the campfires or late at night during the winter festival. They can turn themselves into smoke. They eat the souls of their victims, and before you die they make you go mad. They're full of hate and teeth and claws, and they're the servants of him who forces. He could only whisper the last few words. His master gave an amused look before becoming serious again. "That's all true, but not all Dark Ones possess all those powers. Otherwise the adversary would certainly have won that time. There are more than 20 different Dark Ones that we know of. Each individual one has his own unique powers, and they all serve him." Vera slowly got up from her rocking-chair and shuffled heavily to one of the shelves. From there she fetched a bottle and 3 beakers and placed them on the table. She filled the beakers with an amber liquid, while Falk continued. "About a dozen of these Dark Ones are really relevant to us forest guardians, and only very rarely does one of them come into this neck of the woods." Vera passed them their beakers and sat back on the rocking-chair with her own. She closed her eyes and took a sip. Aaron carefully smelled at his beaker, and his nostrils filled with the sweet, pungent smell of honey mead. He looked at the beaker in awe. Only the wealthy villagers could afford this drink, and then it was normally served in thimble-sized cups. Aaron had never been near a full beaker before. For a moment he even forgot his fear as he admired the priceless treasure. Falk absently raised the beaker to his lips and continued. "Blood wolves were once normal ice wolves, the largest wolves that exist in nature. The adversary forced them under his control. He made them larger and stronger. The more blood they drink, the mightier and angrier they become. In the dark days, the first rule of thumb was to kill the opposing army's blood wolves before they had torn apart too many of their enemies, and their frenzy had become almost unconquerable." Aaron listened in fear and gripped his beaker of mead. Without thinking, he took a drink and felt a warm, burning sensation spreading down his throat and into his stomach. An adult blood wolf can easily defeat a bear, and that's why I'm certain none has entered the forest. I would have heard it long ago and seen its path of destruction. The mead was slowly having its effect, and Aaron's head began to feel light. His fear of the blood wolf disappeared in a gentle fog that seemed to envelop his thoughts. He had relaxed considerably. Vera gave a grunt of satisfaction as she saw the change in the apprentice's appearance. Falk gave him another encouraging tap on the shoulder as he glanced darkly at the healer. "It was completely unnecessary to upset my apprentice like that. A lecture on the Dark Ones is definitely not for the second day of training." Aaron emptied his beaker. The deliciously sweet yet spicy taste of the mead and the feeling of drowsiness and fearlessness that it gave him gave rise to a leaden heaviness in his arms and legs, and he could feel his eyes closing. Suddenly there was an almighty bang that startled him. His eyes shot open, and he saw the stern, weather-beaten face of the old forest guardian a mere hand-span away, looking at him. For a moment Aaron was back in his father's dark hut, and as he screamed and shot his arms up in an effort to protect himself, he threw his body backward, his stool tipped over, and he fell back in a tangle of arms and legs. He stared up at his master in a fog. Falk's hand still lay flat on the table, where he had let it fall in order to wake the boy. Vera clicked her tongue disapprovingly, and Falk scratched his beard with an embarrassed look on his face. "I think we're going to have to get to know each other a little more. I'm really sorry, boy. That's how my master used to wake me up whenever I dozed off doing my exercises. I still forget that you've grown up differently to me." Aaron picked himself up off the floor. His heart was pounding, and he could only nod, because he didn't trust himself to be able to speak. Neither of them could utter a word, and so the two forest guardians only looked at each other in embarrassment. Suddenly a high, squeaky sound could be heard that broke the awkward silence, and both of them turned around to Vera in surprise. She was giggling into her shawl. "You almost managed a somersault, and your feet rubbed off the herbs hanging off the ceiling," Vera spluttered, overcome by a fit of giggling, and pointed upwards. Falk and Aaron looked up in surprise at the slowly swinging bundles of herbs, and burst out laughing themselves. Their mutual embarrassment was punctured by the hilarity of it all. Falk shook his head, finished his mead, and stood up. "That didn't exactly go according to plan. You were supposed to learn something about herbs. Instead, we frightened the life out of you with stories of the Dark Ones, pour alcohol down your throat, and you almost break your neck by falling off the chair." Vera giggled again and also stood up. "Before we leave, I just want to ask if Aaron can drop by now and then and learn how to make the most important creams and compresses. That will give me the chance to do parts of my job which he can't participate in yet, and then he'll also have the odd day when his body can recover." He smiled in Aaron's direction. Vera nodded. "Of course, the boy is a bright spark, and I'm always happy to share my knowledge. It will only be enough to learn the basics, though. If he wants to learn more, I'll have to keep him for 1 or 2 winters." The three of them stepped out into the late afternoon sun, and Vera and Falk gave each other a quick hug. Aaron gave an awkward nod of farewell, and noticed the healer whisper something to his master before breaking away from him. Falk nodded and strode quickly away with an apprentice in tow. The old woman stood in the doorway, and, lost in thought, watched them leave. The return journey to Falk's cabin was surprisingly short. Aaron's master reminded him to remember the direct route so that he would be able to find his own way to Vera's hut the next time. Again and again he pointed out way markings to the boy. These would help him to orientate himself. He also showed him how the position of the sun in the sky could also help determine the correct direction. He didn't use the ball at all on the return journey, much to Aaron's relief. They arrived at the cabin just as dusk was falling, and Falk ordered him to go in and light the fire in the hearth. The night was drawing in, and they were sitting at their evening meal when Aaron asked a question that had occupied his mind before he had become Falk's apprentice.
"Master, where do you actually come from?"
Falk looked up from his bowl quizzically and grunted. "What do you mean?"
"Well, everybody knows that you arrived in Deepstone a long time ago, but there are lots of different opinions about where you came from."
"Is that so?" His older companion's face seemed to darken. "What opinions have you heard?"
"Most people believe you come from the Night Marshes, that you spoke their local dialect in those days. Others think you picked up your knowledge of the Dark Ones in the borderlands. Still others are of the opinion that you lived among the elves of Evergreen," said Aaron as he divulged the most popular theories. His master didn't seem to take too kindly to his question, but Aaron felt he ought to know as much as possible about the man in whose house he was now living. Falk was just about to rebuke him sharply, but then thought better of it. "All those theories have a grain of truth in them, but none of them hits the nail on the head. I received my training in Athenian as part of a punishment. That's what we call the territory of the forest elves, and you should remember that. Evergreen is a very crude translation. The same as if an elf called Deepstone a heavy thing that makes a clunking sound and falls a long way down. It's not only inexact, but it's not in the least aesthetic. It makes you sound like a complete idiot to them." Although this little insight into the language of the elves was fascinating, Aaron was interested in something completely different. "Your training was a punishment?" That would certainly explain his training methods, thought Aaron dryly. "Not what you're thinking. I was a drifter when I arrived in Athenian. I lit a fire in the forest where it was prohibited. I slaughtered an animal that was protected, and I relieved myself in a river that provided drinking water to an elf village 2 miles further along. Even one of these misdemeanors could cost your head among the elves, or, if they were feeling charitable, result in banishment. Quite a few of them wanted to see me dead, but when I was brought before the priestess of Her That Feels to receive my sentence, it turned out she had a finely tuned, if very dark, sense of humor. I had to bear my guilt in the forest until I had undone the damage I had caused. My fire had destroyed an old tree that had stood there for many decades. The animal I had slaughtered had been vital for the maintenance of the balance between predator and prey. The elves take such things very seriously, and so I spent many years learning everything about the forest to make good for this one tree and to bring the wildlife back into balance, which is much harder than I had thought. Certainly if you go by elf standards. Any time I thought I had done the right thing, my mistress would point out to me what the consequences of my actions were. In the end, and with her help, I had made good for the tree and restored the balance, and in the meantime I had become a forest guardian. I didn't want then, and have never wanted since, to be anything else." Aaron stared at his master in silence. He tried to reconcile what he had heard with the man who was sitting in front of him. Falk nodded contentedly when it became clear that his apprentice wasn't going to ask any more questions. "Now you know a little bit more. You're going to have to earn the next personal question." He stood up abruptly, almost as though he regretted having been so open.
I'm going to sleep, clear up, quench the fire, and go to bed too. Tomorrow's going to be a demanding day for you." And with those words Falk went out into the darkness, leaving a very thoughtful apprentice sitting at the table, asking himself what Falk meant by demanding. How, he wondered, would his master describe the last 2 days? Chapter 6. Aaron lay on his mat the following evening wishing he were dead, or that the forest would flee, or that the bailiff would come and take away his master for unnecessary cruelty to apprentices in general and to Aaron in particular, and then lock him up in a particularly dark and damp dungeon. This thought almost made him smile, but even that was sore. With a groan and all the energy he could muster, Aaron managed to turn on his side and slurp a little more soup from the bowl beside his bed. It was supposed to calm his maltreated muscles. It was his 4th portion in the last 2 hours, but his body still felt as if a millstone had rolled over it, a particularly large millstone, with prongs. They had headed off early in the morning, and within a few hundred paces after entering the forest, Falk had led him to an imposing king oak tree that stretched about 30 paces into the air and had enormous sweeping branches. It really was a magnificent tree, and Aaron had looked up at it in amazement until his master said, "Up there in the tree-top is a red towel knotted to it. Can you bring it down for me, please?" Aaron had been delighted. This probably meant there was no running around on the agenda today, and he could give his legs a bit of a rest. He had always liked climbing, and he had a knack for it, but his master knew that already, so why was he testing him again? With a shrug of his shoulders, and an "of course, master," he set to work. He scampered up the first few paces in no time at all. There were many places to hold on to. The branches were wide and secure, and there was plenty of room to turn easily. It was the perfect tree for climbing. It wasn't long before Aaron was up in the top quarter of the tree, but the further he climbed, the harder it became to get a good grip and a secure standing position. Aaron stretched his neck to see where the cloth was tied. Yes, there it was, a red ribbon, fluttering in the breeze about 4 paces above him. With considerable effort, Aaron pulled himself up the final few paces, and at last he reached the piece of cloth knotted to a branch. Aaron had to clasp this branch with his right arm while balancing on a thin branch. He carefully raised his right hand towards the cloth and started loosening it. It took him a minute to finally untangle the knot and stuff the material down his leather jerkin. He had an unimpeded view of the tree-top and saw that under the cloth was a rope tied around the branch. It wound its way in several dozen loops towards the top. Attached to the rope at regular intervals were very small, thin strips of material of various colours. The rope finished a hand-span away from the tip of the tree. Confused, Aaron studied the construction for several heartbeats before making his way back down. His master, after all, had only mentioned the red cloth. Getting down the tree proved to be very easy, and it wasn't long before Aaron was standing in front of his master with a self-satisfied grin. The master took Aaron's trophy with an indifferent look. The cloth was only for orientation, so that you could find your task. I want you to loosen as many strips of cloth as you can during the day and tie them down here around the branch, and only 1 strip per climb. Do you hear me?" That wiped the grin off Aaron's face in no time at all. The climbing was fun and hadn't been particularly strenuous, but there were at least 50 strips of cloth up there, if not more. That would be some slog. "I'm glad we understand each other," grinned Falk. "There's a water skin over there and a piece of cheese. You'd better ration it. In the meantime, I'll go hunting, so we have food for the table again. We're in dire need of some because of the rate you gobble it down. I'll check up on you every now and then, and if you're not climbing, I'll bring all the strips you've brought down back up again." And having issued his threat, he left the boy alone and disappeared into the undergrowth. Aaron stood there for a moment and considered this mammoth task until a loud "Now, Aaron!" echoed from the forest, and he scurried up the tree. He only had a cloudy recollection of the rest of the day. The first few rounds weren't all that difficult, but the continual repetition extracted a high price, and he realized soon enough that the higher the strips were hanging, the more complicated the knots were. This meant longer stretches of the body, and longer periods of keeping his balance, not to mention increasingly complicated movements with his left hand, while his muscles became more and more tired. Aaron had never suffered from a fear of heights, but he became acutely aware, with every new scaling of the tree, that there was a real danger he would fall and break his neck. Around noon he started taking little breaks in the tree so that he wouldn't be surprised by Falk on the ground. Once he'd caught his breath, he would groan or curse and reach for the next branch. He thought of taking more than one piece of cloth at a time, but it wasn't only Aaron who had a wonderful view of the surrounding forest. There were also many tree-tops from which he could easily be spied upon. Aaron had no doubt at all that Falk threw an eye on him from time to time, even if he was out hunting. Aaron was close to tears when his master finally stepped out of the undergrowth. He'd been clinging to the lowest branch of the tree for about an hour, but no matter how hard he'd tried, his arms didn't have enough strength to pull him up to the next branch. He slid clumsily down the tree and collapsed beside the strips of cloth he had collected that day. Falk silently counted the strips and hunkered down opposite Aaron. "You got as far as the blue ones, no?" His voice was warm and friendly, and he looked proudly at Aaron. The boy closed his eyes and nodded tiredly before answering in a quiet, shaky voice, "The blue ones were hanging so high, and the knot seemed to have only one end, just like the ones you made for our tree house, and I still haven't got used to my left hand. I went up 3 times and tried as hard as I could. Then I climbed down to the lowest branch to have a rest, but in the end I couldn't pull myself up again." The last few words were little more than a whisper. "So you've climbed up and down this tree more than 30 times today? No wonder you're tired. I thought you'd only managed to get as far as the green ones, but you've brought them all down." Falk's voice was still warm and friendly, and his obvious compassion, as well as Aaron's exhaustion, were all too much for the boy. He fell into the arms of his stunned master and began to sob uncontrollably. Falk patted him awkwardly on the back and mumbled, "It's all right. Calm yourself. The first time is always the hardest." The apprentice reacted with a jolt and gasped, "The first time?" "Of course, this was no test at all. Here we're training all the muscles in your body. Coordination, endurance, dexterity, and willpower. The ribbon tree was a staple of my basic training, too." Falk released himself gently but firmly from Aaron's embrace, and saw in front of him a youthful and angry face. His tears had left light streaks on the boy's face, which was smudged with earth and tree bark, but as Aaron was rarely angry, his unpractised grimace looked comical rather than threatening. The old guardian decided to ignore the silent rebellion, and with slow deliberation packed away the empty water-skin, the ribbons, and the waxed cheesecloth. Then he turned around to face the boy, who was still looking at him darkly. "That's enough now. If you continue to look daggers at me, I'll send you up in the tree in double-quick time, and you'll have to tie up all the ribbons again." The boy looked quickly up at the tree-top, then at the ribbons in Falk's hand, before turning on his heels and trudging uncertainly away.
Falk smiled, turned away from the tree too, and followed Aaron into the forest. The boy had been so angry that he hadn't noticed that he'd headed the correct way to the cabin without having asked the way. The old man looked down at his hands, still with the 36 unknotted ribbons, nodded to himself, and whispered, "A start." Aaron groaned and turned on his back again. The soup bowl was empty. He had made his way back to the cabin in brooding silence, had tortuously taken off his leathers and curled up under the blanket. Falk, too, had remained silent, prepared the meal, and patiently placed one bowl after another beside the mat. But now his master was outside. The glow from the dying fire gradually faded, and the inside of the cabin was bathed in a soft red shimmer, making the contours of the room appear softer and somehow more fluid. Aaron mulled over the injustice of the world, and how he had to end up with the worst possible slave-driver of a master, before his exhaustion overwhelmed him like a black wave, and between one breath and the next he was in a deep slumber. The low snoring coming from inside the cabin told Falk that the youngster had fallen asleep, and, with a sigh of relief, he leaned against the tree where he had set up his place for the night. He massaged his forehead and was glad he had weathered the day. What had he been thinking of taking on an apprentice? The reasons he had listed out to the young boy were all true, of course, but he, of all people, training someone? He had spoken more in the last 4 days than he had in the whole 3 months previously, and he would have to be a little more careful. The boy would only have finished his 13th summer by autumn, and in Falk's case he had completed his training as a well-drilled adult. And there were other advantages he had enjoyed that he didn't want to think about now. That was all such a long time ago, and really belonged to the past. Damn it, the boy was even disturbing his peace of mind. He stood up and walked a few steps into the forest. And, following a custom going back decades, he whispered, as every evening, "Zelsina, is that you?" He waited a few heartbeats, then turned with a sorrowful look. He had only taken one tired step when there was a rustling behind him. Falk froze in mid-movement, didn't stir an inch. Nothing more than a whisper escaped his lips, a quietly whispered word, permeated with a wild, frustrated hopefulness. "Zelsina?" The leaves behind him rustled again. Falk didn't turn around, but collapsed into himself where he stood, like a puppet whose cords had been cut. Nobody could see the tears rolling down his weather-beaten skin. "The years without you were very long," he said, his voice breaking. The leaves were no longer moving, but they didn't need to. Falk tilted his head low, as he always did when she spoke with him, before answering. "Yes, I know it was my fault. What has changed?" A few seconds passed. "The boy? Really?" Falk still didn't turn. His eyes were closed, and he felt a large body coming closer behind and towering over him. "I'm speaking out loud because I'm out of practice. After all, it's been many years." He reached up and stroked the soft fur. "Are you staying?" Falk hated himself for the frustration evident in his voice, but she could read his thoughts anyway, so it really made no difference. The answer wasn't the one he had hoped for, but at least it was so comforting that he gave a quick laugh. She had always had a sharp sense of humour. "Good, so nearby, until the boy has made himself at home. Otherwise he'll end up running away from us, screaming." Us. The word echoed within Falk, and suddenly all the dams burst. The irony wasn't lost on Falk that he was now behaving like his 13-year-old apprentice this afternoon, who had thrown himself at him and sobbed uncontrollably. It didn't bother him. The night concealed him, the forest embraced him, and Celsina was back. All was well.